People always ask me why I bought a house at 29 instead of traveling, instead of renting a cute apartment downtown with exposed brick and a rooftop deck, instead of doing all the things a single woman in her late 20s is supposed to do before she settles down. My answer was always the same. I wanted something that was mine, not something I split with roommates, not something my parents co-signed as a favor they'd remind me of for the rest of my life, not something I'd have to give back if a relationship ended or a job fell through. Mine. I found the house on Larkspur Lane on a gray Tuesday in March, the kind of gray that Ohio specializes in, where the sky looks like a dish rag that's been wrung out too many times. It was a 1948 Craftsman bungalow with a wraparound porch that sagged slightly on the north side, original oak floors that some previous owner had covered in ugly beige carpet, and a kitchen that hadn't been touched since Nixon was in office. The listing photos made it look like a teardown. I saw it and started crying in the driveway before I even had the key in my hand. I want to explain something about myself before I tell you what my parents did, because you need to understand what this house meant, and you need to understand what kind of person I was before all of this happened, so that you can appreciate exactly how much of myself I had to bury in order to survive what came next. My name is Claire Bennett. I grew up in Willowbrook, a town outside Columbus that's exactly the kind of place you picture when someone says, small Ohio town. A main street with a hardware store that's been there for 60 years, a Methodist church with a white steeple, a diner where the waitresses call you Hon, whether they know you or not. My father, Richard, worked as a regional manager for an insurance company for 31 years, the kind of steady, unglamorous job that pays the mortgage and puts two kids through braces but never quite covers a real vacation. My mother, Linda, stayed home when we were small, and then went back to work part-time at the elementary school library once my brother started kindergarten. It was, on paper, a normal family, a nice family, the kind of family neighbors wave at. I have one sibling. My brother Tyler is 2 years younger than me, and from the moment he was born, something shifted in our house that never shifted back. I don't say that with bitterness, or at least I try not to. I say it because it's the plain, flat truth, the kind of truth you spend years trying not to see, because seeing it means admitting something ugly about people you're supposed to love unconditionally. Tyler was the golden one. Not because he did anything spectacular. He wasn't a prodigy, wasn't the smartest kid in his class, wasn't destined for the Olympics or Juilliard. He was golden simply because he was Tyler, because he smiled a certain way that made adults melt, because he was easygoing where I was serious, because he never seemed to worry about anything and somehow that made people want to protect him from ever having to. I was the responsible one. I got straight A's. I worked a part-time job at the pharmacy starting at 16. I paid for my own car insurance. I went to community college for 2 years before transferring to Ohio State, so I wouldn't graduate with crushing debt. I did everything right, is what I'm saying. I did everything the way you're supposed to do it if you want a stable, unremarkable, successful life. And somewhere along the way, doing everything right became invisible. Nobody throws a parade for the kid who never needed saving. Tyler, on the other hand, needed saving constantly, and our parents built an entire family economy around the saving of him. He failed a grade in middle school, and my parents blamed the teacher. He got a DUI at 19, and my father hired a lawyer who got it knocked down to reckless operation, and then told relatives at Thanksgiving that Tyler had learned so much from the experience, as if the experience had been a semester abroad instead of a night in a holding cell that cost them $4,000 in legal fees. He dropped out of 2 different colleges, and both times my parents referred to it as him taking time to find himself. While I remember distinctly being told, when I once considered switching my major from accounting to art history for exactly 1 semester, that I needed to be realistic and stop wasting money on self-indulgence. I'm telling you all of this not to relitigate my entire childhood, though I could. Believe me, I could write you a very long book about the years of small comparisons and quiet erasures that built the foundation for what happened later. I'm telling you this because you need the pattern. You need to see the shape of it, the way water wears a groove into stone over decades, so that when I tell you what my parents did the year I turned 34, you understand that it wasn't an aberration. It wasn't a one-time lapse in judgment by two people who otherwise loved their children equally. It was the logical, inevitable conclusion of a lifetime of a very specific arithmetic. Tyler's wants counted as needs, and my needs counted as wants. By the time I bought the house on Larkspur Lane, I had spent 13 years building a career as a financial analyst, first at a regional bank and then at a mid-sized investment firm in Columbus, the kind of job where I spent my 20s learning to read balance sheets and risk assessments and the subtle language of contracts. A skill set that I promise you will become extremely relevant later in this story. I had saved for 6 years for that down payment. 6 years of packed lunches and a car I drove until it had 190,000 miles on it, and a rule I made for myself that I would not touch a single dollar of that house fund no matter what happened, no matter who asked, no matter how guilty anyone tried to make me feel. The house took me 18 months to renovate, working on it every weekend, learning to do things I never thought I'd learn to do. I pulled up that ugly beige carpet myself and found oak floors underneath that I refinished by hand, on my knees, with a rented sander, for 3 consecutive weekends until my shoulders ached in a way I'd never felt before. I repainted every room. I hired an electrician for the parts that were genuinely dangerous, but I did the rest myself, watching tutorial videos at midnight after full days at the office, teaching myself how to hang a door properly, how to patch plaster, how to tile a backsplash so it didn't look like a middle schooler's first shop project. That house became the physical proof of every choice I had made in my life, every sacrifice. Every year I said no to a vacation because I was saving. Every extra shift I picked up. Every time I sat quietly at a family dinner while my parents described, in loving detail, the ski trip they were financing for Tyler and his girlfriend, and I said nothing, because saying something had never once, in 30-some years, changed anything. I want you to hold that house in your mind. Picture the porch, the oak floors, the kitchen I redid with butcher block counters I sanded myself. Picture 6 years of saving and 18 months of blistered hands, because in the fall I turned 34, my parents sold it, without telling me, to send my brother and his fiancée on a 3-week honeymoon to the Maldives. And the worst part, the part that still makes my stomach drop even now, all this time later, is that legally, on paper, they thought they had every right to do it. They were wrong, but it would take a folder, 3 lawyers, 1 very quiet year of my own preparation, and a family dinner that nobody at that table will ever forget, before they understood exactly how wrong they were. To understand how my parents were even in a position to attempt what they attempted, I have to take you back 2 years, to a Tuesday night in April when my appendix burst at 11 o'clock at night, and I ended up in an ambulance on my way to Riverside Methodist with a fever of 103, and a surgeon telling me, in the calm voice doctors use right before they tell you something terrifying, that I needed emergency surgery within the hour. I called my mother from the ER because that's what you do. Even when you're 32 years old and financially independent and haven't asked your parents for help with anything in over a decade. When your body is failing you at midnight, you call your mother. She and my father got there just as they were wheeling me back for pre-op, and somewhere in that blur of fluorescent lights and IV lines, and a nurse asking me repeatedly to rate my pain on a scale of 1 to 10, a hospital administrator came in with a clipboard and started talking about advance directives and power of attorney documents, Standard hospital paperwork they ask every surgical patient to consider, just in case something goes wrong on the table. I was scared. I was in more pain than I had ever experienced in my life, and somewhere in my drugged, terrified haze, my mother squeezed my hand and said, "Just sign it, sweetheart. It's just in case. It's just so your father and I can make decisions if you can't. You know we'd never do anything you wouldn't want." And I signed a durable power of attorney naming my mother, Linda Bennett, as my agent, because I was about to go under anesthesia for emergency surgery, and I would have signed absolutely anything to make the fear stop for 30 seconds. The surgery went fine. I was home within 4 days, back at work within 3 weeks, and the power of attorney document went into a folder in my parents' filing cabinet and, more importantly, into my own memory as a footnote. A piece of hospital bureaucracy from a frightening night I mostly wanted to forget. I never revoked it. Why would I have thought to? It had served its purpose. My appendix was gone. I was healthy. And the idea that my mother might someday use a document I'd signed while doped up on fentanyl to sell my house out from under me was not a thought that crossed my mind, because what kind of person does that? What kind of parent does that? I genuinely did not know, at that point in my life, that the answer to that question was going to be my own parents. I want to pause here and tell you a little more about Tyler and about his fiancée Brianna, because their relationship is the second half of the machinery that made everything else possible. Tyler proposed to Brianna at a winery in the fall, a proposal my parents paid for almost entirely. The private tasting, the photographer hired to hide in the vines, the ring itself, which my father had helped Tyler finance because, and I quote something my father said at a family dinner not long after, "A man should be able to give his fiancée the ring she deserves, and Tyler's just getting on his feet." Tyler, at that point, was 32 years old and had been just getting on his feet for roughly a decade. He worked in sales for a company that sold industrial cleaning supplies, a job he'd held for about 2 years, which was, by his standards, a personal record for longevity. Brianna was sweet. Genuinely. I want to be fair to her. She was never unkind to me, but she had absorbed the family mythology about Tyler completely. The idea that he was a diamond in the rough who just needed the right support to blossom into the man everyone knew he could be. A narrative my parents had been constructing since he was approximately 7 years old, and it had never once come true. But nobody in my family seemed capable of updating their beliefs based on actual evidence, which I suppose is its own kind of psychological talent. When they got engaged, my mother started talking about the wedding constantly, at every family gathering, in every phone call, a running commentary on venues and dress shopping, and how Tyler deserves a beautiful wedding after everything he's been through. And I remember sitting there thinking, everything he's been through? Tyler had been through nothing. Tyler had been cushioned from every consequence of every choice he'd ever made since birth. But I smiled and nodded, because that is what I had learned to do at family dinners for 30-some years. Smile and nod and pass the mashed potatoes and let the conversation happen around me like weather. Then, about 8 months before the wedding, the honeymoon conversation started, and this is where things began to shift from the ordinary background radiation of my family's favoritism into something that would eventually threaten everything I had built with my own 2 hands. Brianna had always dreamed of the Maldives, one of those overwater bungalow resorts you see in Instagram photos, the turquoise water, the private plunge pool, 3 weeks of total isolation and luxury that cost, as I would later learn, just under $60,000 for the package Tyler booked, including business-class flights, a private boat transfer, and a vow renewal ceremony package that seemed to exist purely to extract more money from people in love. $60,000. Tyler did not have $60,000. Tyler, as far as I could tell from years of quiet observation, did not have $6,000 in savings. And my parents, on a combined pension and part-time library salary, absolutely did not have $60,000 sitting around either. Not after they'd already paid for the ring, the proposal, and were quietly covering nearly half the cost of the wedding itself. A fact I only pieced together later from comments my mother made, without seeming to register how much she was revealing. So the question became, at some point during a summer I was mostly unaware of, in conversations happening in my parents' kitchen and over the phone between my mother and father, a question I imagine went something like this. Where do two people in their 60s, with a modest fixed income and a house that was already mortgaged, find $60,000 to give their golden son the honeymoon his golden fiancé had always dreamed of? And somewhere in that conversation, somebody remembered a filing cabinet and a folder and a signature from a night 2 years earlier when their daughter had been too frightened and too drugged to think about anything except staying alive. I found out by accident, the way you find out about most betrayals, not through a confession, not through someone finally telling you the truth out of guilt, but through a small, strange detail that doesn't fit, a loose thread that you pull on only because it's Tuesday and you're bored and something feels slightly off. It was a Saturday morning in late September. I was refinishing the trim in my guest bedroom, the one room I hadn't gotten to yet, kneeling on a drop cloth with a paintbrush in my hand, when my neighbor Deb knocked on my door. Deb is 71 years old, has lived on Larkspur Lane for 40 years, and knows literally everything that happens on our street before it happens, the kind of neighbor who is either a nightmare or a blessing depending entirely on whether you have anything to hide. I saw a woman taking pictures of your porch yesterday, Deb said, standing on my doorstep with her arms crossed against the September chill. Real estate lady, I think. Had one of those tablet things, walked all around the yard, took pictures of the roofline, wrote things down. I remember laughing, actually laughing, and saying, "You must be thinking of the Hendersons' house, Deb. I'm not selling." "No, I know your house," Deb said, a little offended that I'd doubt her memory, which, to be fair, I never should have doubted. Deb's memory was a steel trap. Blue Honda Civic, parked right out front. She was here almost 40 minutes. I figured maybe you were getting an appraisal for insurance or something. I stood there in my paint-splattered clothes, feeling the first cold trickle of something that wasn't quite fear yet. More like confusion, the sensation of a piece of furniture being slightly out of place in a room you know intimately. I hadn't ordered an appraisal. I hadn't spoken to a real estate agent in the 2 years since I'd closed on the house. Nobody should have had any reason to be photographing my roofline. I thanked Deb, went back inside, and did what any financial analyst with a healthy dose of paranoia would do. I checked my email for anything unusual, checked my mail for anything I might have missed, and then, when nothing turned up, I did a property search on the county auditor's website, just to see if anything looked strange with my listing information. Everything looked normal. My name was still listed as the owner. Nothing had changed. I told myself Deb had probably seen a real estate agent going door to door, that these things happen sometimes when a neighborhood starts to get hot and agents go around leaving flyers, trying to drum up listings. I let it go. Or I tried to. But 3 days later, I got a call from a number I didn't recognize. A woman with a bright, professional voice who introduced herself as Sandra from a real estate brokerage I'd never heard of, and said she was just following up on the listing paperwork and wanted to confirm a walkthrough time for the property on Larkspur. I sat very still in my kitchen, my hand suddenly cold around my phone. "I think there's been a mistake," I said carefully. "I haven't listed my house." There was a pause on the other end, the particular pause of someone realizing they've stepped into something they don't understand. "I'm so sorry," Sandra said. "I must have the wrong file. Have a good day." And she hung up before I could ask another single question. I did not have a good day. I sat at my kitchen table for a long time after that call, staring at the wall, running through every possible innocent explanation and finding that none of them held together. A mistaken listing doesn't come with a neighbor's eyewitness account of a real estate agent photographing your specific roofline. A wrong number doesn't apologize and hang up quite that fast, quite that guiltily. I called the brokerage back myself, using the general line instead of the number Sandra had called from, and told the receptionist I was trying to reach an agent regarding a property on Larkspur Lane in Willowbrook, that I believed there'd been some confusion about a listing. She put me on hold for 4 minutes, and when she came back, her voice had changed, gotten careful and professionally evasive in a way that told me everything before she said a single useful word. "I'm going to have someone call you back about that," she said. "Can I get your name?" I gave her my name. Claire Bennett. There was a silence on the other end that lasted just slightly too long, a silence I would think about for months afterward, because it was in that silence, I believe, that whoever was on the other end of that phone recognized my name from a document sitting somewhere in their file, a durable power of attorney, signed 2 years earlier in a hospital pre-op room, naming someone else entirely as the person authorized to sell my house. Nobody called me back that day. Nobody called me back the next day either. It was my mother, 3 days after that, who called me on a Thursday evening while I was making dinner, her voice bright and casual in a way that immediately made every hair on my arm stand up, and said, "Claire, honey, we need to talk about something, and I want you to hear us out before you get upset." I turned off the stove. I remember that detail specifically, the small, absurd domestic detail of reaching over and clicking the burner off under a pan of half-cooked ground turkey, because some instinct in me understood that whatever was about to happen deserved my full attention, that I would not be able to cook dinner and survive this conversation at the same time. "Hear you out about what, Mom?" I said, and I kept my voice level, because I already knew. I think some part of me had known since Deb mentioned the woman with the tablet, but there's a difference between suspecting something and having a parent confirm it to your face, a difference between a shadow on an X-ray and the doctor telling you the word cancer. My mother took a breath, the kind of breath people take before they deliver news they've rehearsed, and said, "Your father and I have made a decision, and we want you to understand, it comes from a place of love. You know how much Tyler's wedding means to this family. And Brianna has always dreamed of the Maldives, and with everything going on with the venue costs, we realized we needed to find another way to help them start this new chapter." "Mom," I said, "what did you do?" "We're going to sell the Larkspur house," she said, and even now, all this time later, I can still hear the exact cadence of how she said it, breezy and certain, like she was telling me they'd decided to repaint the guest bathroom. "Your father has power of attorney. Well, I do, technically, from your surgery, remember? And we talked to a lawyer, and it's completely legal, honey. We checked. The market's so good right now, and that house has appreciated so much since you bought it. We'd never have imagined it was worth what it's worth now. It'll cover the honeymoon and help with some of the wedding costs, too, and you'll still get some money out of it. We're not trying to take everything. We just need the difference. And honestly, sweetheart, you're doing so well at your job, you could buy another house in no time. This one is really more house than a single woman needs anyway." I want you to sit with that sentence for a moment, the way I had to sit with it in my kitchen with a pan of cooling ground turkey and a wooden spoon still in my hand. This one is really more house than a single woman needs anyway. Not, "We're sorry." Not, "We know this is your home." A real estate assessment of my worthiness to occupy space, delivered by my own mother, as a kind of consolation prize for the fact that she was about to take that space away from me. "You used a power of attorney from 2 years ago," I said slowly, "from when I had emergency surgery, to sell my house. Without asking me." "We're asking you now," my mother said, and I could hear the faint note of irritation creeping into her voice, the tone she used when she felt she was being unreasonably challenged for something perfectly reasonable. We wanted to tell you before it went any further. That's why I'm calling. The realtor already has some interest. There's a young couple who saw it online and loved it. They're pre-approved and everything, so things could move fast, and we just want everyone to be on the same page. There is no page, Mom. I never agreed to this. I'm not agreeing to this now. Claire. And here it was. The tone I had heard my entire life. The tone reserved specifically for moments when I was inconveniencing the family narrative by having feelings of my own. This isn't just about you. This is about your brother's entire future. Do you know what it would do to this family if we had to cancel that honeymoon? Brianna's mother already told half her book club about the Maldives. Tyler would be humiliated. We are not going to humiliate your brother over a house you barely even live in half the time because you're always at work. I want to tell you that I screamed. I want to tell you I said something sharp and devastating that made my mother finally understand the depth of what she was doing. But that's not what happened. What happened is that something in me went very, very quiet. A stillness I recognized from moments in my career when a deal was about to fall apart, and I needed every part of my mind clear and cold to keep it from happening. Mom, I said, I need you to listen to me very carefully. That house is not yours to sell. That power of attorney was for medical decisions during a surgery 2 years ago. It does not give you authority over my property. Our lawyer said it does, my mother said, and there was something almost smug underneath the false brightness now, the particular confidence of a person who believes she has already won an argument before it started. It's a durable financial power of attorney, Claire, not just medical. You signed the whole document. I have it right here. It gives me authority to act on your behalf regarding your assets until it's formally revoked, and you never revoked it. I checked with the lawyer myself. It's completely legal. And there it was. The word that would define the next year of my life. Legal. She was right about one thing, and it terrified me for exactly the length of that phone call, before something else. Something I will tell you about very soon reminded me that being right about the letter of an old document is not remotely the same thing as being right about what happens next. I'll call you tomorrow, I said, and I hung up before she could respond, and I stood in my kitchen with the phone in my hand, staring at the pan of turkey going cold and gray on the stove, in the house I had spent 6 years saving for and 18 months rebuilding with my own hands, and I did not cry. I want to be honest with you about that, because I think it surprised even me. I did not cry. Something colder and clearer than tears was already beginning to take shape in me, because 3 months earlier, for reasons that had nothing to do with any of this, I had already done something that was about to make my mother's confident little phrase, completely legal, into the biggest miscalculation of her entire life. To understand why I didn't cry in that kitchen, I need to take you back to June, 3 months before that phone call, to an otherwise unremarkable Sunday dinner at my parents' house that changed the entire trajectory of what was about to happen to me, though I didn't know it at the time. We were sitting around my parents' dining table, my mother, my father, Tyler, Brianna, and me, eating a pot roast my mother had made, and the conversation had turned, as it always did that summer, to the wedding. My mother was describing some new idea for the reception, and my father, who rarely said much at these dinners beyond agreeing with whatever my mother had already decided, made an offhand comment that snagged in my mind like a splinter. He said, "Well, we'll figure out the money somehow. We always do. Might have to get creative." And he glanced at my mother when he said it. A quick look. The kind of look two people share when they're both thinking about something they haven't said out loud yet. And my mother gave the smallest shake of her head, almost imperceptible, the universal silent language of not now, not in front of everyone. I noticed it because I am, by profession and by temperament, a person who notices small inconsistencies in financial conversations. It is quite literally what I am paid to do. Sit in rooms with executives and find the sentence that doesn't match the spreadsheet, the glance that doesn't match the confidence in someone's voice. And something about that exchange between my parents sat wrong with me for the rest of that evening. The way a slightly flat note sits wrong in a piece of music you know well, even if you can't name the exact key. I didn't think, at that point, oh, they're going to sell my house. That thought would have seemed insane to me in June. But I did think, they are hiding a financial plan from me. And given how the last 34 years of my life had gone, given the arithmetic of Tyler's needs versus my wants that had governed every family decision since I was 2 years old, I thought it would be prudent. And I want to be honest, this was as much about protecting my 10 years of retirement savings and investment accounts as it was about protecting the house. At that point, I genuinely didn't know what creative meant, to quietly get my own affairs in order. The next week, I called a lawyer. Her name was Patricia Alvarez, and I found her the unglamorous way, through a friend from work who had used her for a straightforward estate planning matter and said she was thorough and didn't waste your money on unnecessary paperwork. I sat in Patricia's office on a Wednesday during my lunch hour and told her, somewhat sheepishly, that I wasn't sure exactly what I needed, but that I had a strange feeling about my family's finances, and I wanted to make sure my assets, particularly my house, were protected, whatever that meant. Patricia asked me a series of questions that, at the time, felt almost like overkill, and that I would later be endlessly, permanently grateful for. Did I have any existing powers of attorney on file? Did anyone else's name appear on the title of my house? Had I ever signed any documents giving anyone else authority over my finances, even temporarily, even years ago? And that is when I remembered the hospital, the pre-op room, the clipboard. My mother's hand squeezing mine and saying, "Just sign it, sweetheart." I told Patricia about it almost as an aside, not thinking it was relevant, a piece of hospital admin trivia from 2 years earlier, and I watched her expression shift from professional pleasantness into something sharper, more focused. "Do you have a copy of that document?" she asked. I didn't, but the hospital did, and within a week Patricia's office had pulled the records and confirmed what I'd feared the moment I saw her face change. It wasn't a limited medical power of attorney at all. It was a broad, durable, financial and medical power of attorney, drafted by the hospital's standard intake system and, crucially, never revoked, meaning that on paper, my mother, Linda Bennett, had the legal authority at that very moment, sitting in Patricia's office in June, to make financial decisions on my behalf, including, Patricia confirmed this for me in plain, careful language, decisions about real property. My house. I remember the exact physical sensation of hearing that. It was like standing in a familiar room and suddenly realizing there's a trap door under the rug you've walked across 1,000 times. "I want to revoke it," I said immediately. "Today, however that works." "We can absolutely do that," Patricia said. "It's a straightforward process. I'll draft a formal notice of revocation, you'll sign it, and we'll record it with the county recorder's office so it's part of the public record. I'd also recommend sending certified copies to your parents directly, so there's no ambiguity that they've received actual notice." Here is where I want to pause and tell you something important about the choice I made next, because it is the single decision that made everything that followed possible, and I have thought about it many times since, wondering if I did the right thing, and I have always, always landed on yes. I told Patricia I wanted to revoke the power of attorney formally and record it with the county. That part was non-negotiable, and it happened within 2 weeks. Quiet and clean, a document filed in a government office that nobody in my family thought to check. Because why would they? Why would anyone imagine their 34-year-old daughter had quietly gone to a lawyer over an offhand comment at a pot roast dinner? But I told Patricia I did not want to send certified notice to my parents yet. Not because I wanted to trap anyone. At that point, I genuinely wasn't sure anything was actually going to happen. But because some old, tired, 34 years in the making part of me needed to know, once and for all, whether my suspicion was paranoid or whether it was accurate. I needed, I think, for my own sanity, actual proof of what my family was capable of, rather than a lifetime of vague, deniable slights I could never quite hold up to the light. Patricia, to her credit, didn't push back hard, though she did make me sign an acknowledgement that I understood the risks of delaying formal notice, and then she said something I have thought about constantly since. Whatever happens next, Claire, you'll have documentation. The revocation is recorded. If anyone tries to act under that old authority, it will be void, and provable, and dated before whatever they attempt. You've protected yourself. Now you just have to decide what you want to do with that protection. I went home that night, back to the house on Larkspur Lane, and I sat on my newly refinished floors in the room I'd sanded by hand, and I put together a folder. A physical, blue, 3-ring folder, the kind you buy at an office supply store for $4, and I began filling it. The recorded revocation. Copies of the original power of attorney document. My deed. My mortgage statements, showing every payment I had made alone, in my name, from an account no one else had ever touched. And, over the following weeks, quietly, methodically, other things too, but I'll tell you about those as they become relevant. I put the folder in the bottom drawer of my desk under a stack of old tax returns, and I went back to my life. And I told myself I was probably overreacting, that my parents loved me, that nothing would come of any of it. 3 months later, my mother called me on a Thursday evening and told me, in a bright and casual voice, that she and my father had decided to sell my house to pay for my brother's honeymoon. I didn't sleep much that night. I lay in my bed, in my house, looking at the ceiling I had painted myself, a soft dove gray I'd chosen after testing 11 different samples on that same wall, and I ran through every possible outcome, every version of the coming weeks, like an analyst stress testing a portfolio against every conceivable market condition. At 7 the next morning, before I even let myself have coffee, I called Patricia Alvarez's office and left a message that this was urgent. She called me back by 9, and I told her everything. The phone call from the woman named Sandra, Deb's account of the real estate agent photographing my porch, and finally, my mother's call the night before, her voice bright and certain as she informed me that, "Our lawyer said it's completely legal." Patricia was quiet for a moment after I finished, and then she said in the calm, almost amused voice of someone who has just been handed an unusually clean case, "Claire, I need you to understand something, and I need you to really hear it, because I know this is emotional for you, but from a purely legal standpoint, what I'm about to tell you should make you feel significantly better. The power of attorney they're relying on was formally revoked 3 months ago. That revocation was recorded with the county recorder's office, which means it is part of the public record, searchable by any title company doing due diligence on this property. Any attorney worth their retainer who actually reviewed the county records, rather than just relying on a client's word that they had power of attorney, would have found that revocation within about 10 minutes. "So they can't sell it," I said. It wasn't quite a question. I needed to hear her say it in plain words anyway. "They cannot legally sell it," Patricia confirmed. "Any attempt to do so using that power of attorney is void. If they proceed to closing anyway, if a title company somehow misses the recorded revocation, which does happen, title companies make mistakes, especially with rushed timelines. Then, what you'd be looking at isn't just a failed sale. you'd be looking at a fraudulent conveyance. Potentially forgery, if your mother is representing to a title company or buyer that she currently holds valid authority she knows has been revoked. That's not a family disagreement at that point, Claire. That's a crime. I sat with that word for a long moment. Crime. My mother. In the same sentence. What do you want to do? Patricia asked, and there was something careful in how she asked it. The tone of a professional who has seen 100 clients in 100 kinds of family pain and knows that the legally correct move and the emotionally survivable move are not always the same thing. Here is the truth about what happened inside me in that moment, sitting at my kitchen table with my coffee finally going cold beside me, the same table where I'd stood 2 nights before with a pan of turkey and a phone in my hand. I had spent 34 years being the reasonable one, the one who absorbed disappointment quietly so the family machine could keep running smoothly, the one who did not make scenes, the one who smiled at Thanksgiving while my brother's DUI got reframed as a growth experience. And in that moment, something in me simply and finally stopped being willing to do that anymore. I want to let it play out, I told Patricia. I want to see exactly how far they're willing to go. I want them to actually try. I don't want to call my mother today and tell her the power of attorney is void, because if I do that, they'll just find some other way to justify what they're doing to themselves, some other story where they're the reasonable ones, and I'm the difficult daughter standing in the way of her brother's happiness. I want proof, real proof, in writing of exactly what they attempted, because I have spent my entire life being told I'm remembering things wrong, that I'm too sensitive, that it wasn't really like that. I am done accepting a version of my own life that isn't true. Patricia was quiet for a second, and then she said, with something that might have been respect in her voice, "Okay, then here's what we're going to do." We spent the next hour building a plan, and I won't walk you through every legal detail because some of it is exactly as dry as you'd expect a discussion of title insurance and recorded instruments to be. But the shape of it was this. I would not intervene yet. I would let the sale process continue exactly as my parents had started it, gathering every piece of documentation I could along the way, every email, every text, every voicemail, everything my parents put in writing, believing themselves to be perfectly within their rights. Patricia would quietly monitor the title company's file, using her own professional access to make sure nothing actually closed, so that no innocent buyer got hurt in the process. And I would go to my brother's engagement dinner the following weekend, an event I'd already promised to attend, and I would sit at that table, and I would smile, and I would say nothing. I hung up the phone feeling something I had not felt in longer than I could remember. Not happiness, exactly. Something closer to clarity. The particular, cold, clean feeling of finally understanding the actual shape of the game you've been playing your entire life without realizing it was a game at all. That Sunday, at Tyler and Brianna's engagement dinner, my mother pulled me aside in the kitchen while everyone else was in the living room, and she took both my hands and said, "Thank you for being so understanding about the house, Claire. I know it wasn't easy news, but I always knew you'd come around. You've always been the mature one." I smiled at her. I want you to picture that smile, because I have thought about it many times since. How easy it was, how genuinely warm it must have looked. Because for the first time in a very long time, I was not performing calm to protect anyone else's feelings. I was calm, all the way down, because I already knew something my mother did not know yet. Something she would not know for another 6 weeks. "Of course, Mom," I said. "Family takes care of each other." She hugged me. I hugged her back. And in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a stack of old tax returns, in a $4 blue folder from an office supply store, the evidence continued to accumulate. The next 6 weeks were, without question, one of the strangest periods of my life, because I was living two entirely separate realities at once. In one reality, I was Claire, the understanding daughter, showing up to family dinners, asking Brianna polite questions about wedding centerpieces, letting my mother describe her plans for helping the young couple with a house sale I now knew, with absolute legal certainty, could not actually happen. In the other reality, I was quietly, methodically building a case file that would have made any forensic accountant proud. I want to tell you about some of what went into that folder because I think it matters. I think the specific texture of the evidence matters because it's easy to hear, "My parents tried to sell my house," as an abstract wrong, but it's another thing entirely to hold in your hands the actual paper trail of exactly how casually, how thoughtlessly, people you love can decide to take something that isn't theirs. My mother texted me a photo, about 2 weeks into this period, of a young couple standing on my porch. My porch, with its slightly sagging north side that I'd been meaning to fix, the porch swing I'd installed myself the previous summer. With the caption, "Aren't they cute? I think they're going to make an offer. They loved your kitchen backsplash." I stared at that text for a long time. She had sent me, unprompted, cheerful documentation of strangers falling in love with my house. I saved the screenshot immediately and printed it that same evening. A week after that, my father called me, something he rarely did, since phone calls in our family were traditionally my mother's department, and he sounded almost apologetic, in the particular way my father got apologetic, which mostly involved talking around a subject rather than through it. "Your mother tells me things are moving along with the Larkspur house," he said. "I just want you to know, we're going to make sure you get a fair cut once everything with Tyler's wedding and the honeymoon is squared away. We're not trying to shortchange you, sweetheart." "A fair cut," I repeated. "Well, sure," he said, sounding slightly wounded that I hadn't immediately expressed gratitude. "It's your house, technically, we know that. We just need to use some of the equity right now, and you'll get whatever's left once the loans and the honeymoon and some of the wedding costs are covered." I asked him, as casually as I could manage, whether they had an estimate yet of what whatever's left might be. And he said, without any apparent awareness of how the sentence sounded out loud, "Honestly, probably not much. Once you factor in the honeymoon, the venue deposit we still owe, and paying off part of the home equity line we took out for the wedding photographer. But you're doing so well at your job, Claire. You don't need it the way Tyler and Brianna need this." I recorded that call. Ohio is a one-party consent state for phone recording, meaning I was legally allowed to record a conversation I was a participant in without telling the other person, a fact I had confirmed with Patricia before any of this began, precisely because I suspected I might need exactly this kind of recording someday. I want to be honest that there is a particular, strange grief in recording your own father say, in essentially so many words, that your labor and your equity exist to fund your brother's life, and that you personally will receive whatever crumbs remain after everyone else's needs are satisfied. I cried after that call, alone in my car in a grocery store parking lot, in a way I had not let myself cry during any of the previous conversations. Not because the sentiment surprised me, because hearing it stated so plainly, so casually, confirmed 34 years of a suspicion I had spent my whole life trying not to fully believe. Then I wiped my face, went inside, bought groceries, and added the recording to the folder. 2 weeks after that call, the young couple, their names were Mark and Jenny Castellano, I'd learn later, a sweet couple expecting their first child, looking for exactly the kind of starter home my house represented, made a formal offer. My mother called me, practically giddy, to tell me the number. $285,000, well above what I'd paid 6 years earlier, a testament to how much the neighborhood had appreciated and, though she didn't put it this way, a testament to how much sweat equity I'd poured into that house with my own hands. "Isn't that wonderful?" she said. "We're going to sign the paperwork with the title company next week and get everything moving toward closing. The realtor thinks we could close within about a month." "That's great, Mom," I said, and I meant every syllable of it, though not remotely in the way she thought I did, because I knew, and Patricia's contact at the title company had confirmed for us quietly and unofficially, that the title search on that property was going to turn up a recorded revocation of power of attorney dated 3 months before any of this began, and that no closing was ever, under any circumstances, going to happen on the terms my mother imagined. I asked her, gently, almost innocently, whether she was planning to tell the Castellanos anything about the family situation, about whose house it actually was, and my mother laughed, a light, dismissive laugh, and said, "Oh, Claire, it's just paperwork, honey. They don't need to know the whole family history. As far as they're concerned, I'm just the seller's authorized representative. It's all completely standard." I hung up the phone that day and sat for a long moment in my quiet kitchen, thinking about Mark and Jenny Castellano, a young couple I had never met, who had fallen in love with my kitchen backsplash and my hand-refinished floors and my porch swing, who had no idea they were about to become collateral damage in a family drama they knew nothing about, and I understood, with total clarity, that whatever came next, I needed to make sure those two people didn't get hurt in the crossfire of what my family had set into motion. Patricia called me on a Wednesday afternoon in late October, and I could hear something different in her voice the moment I picked up, a kind of restrained professional satisfaction that I would come to associate, over the following months, with the sound of a plan working exactly as designed. "The title company flagged it," she said. "Standard procedure. They ran a full title search as part of underwriting the buyer's title insurance policy, and the recorded revocation came up immediately. It's dated, it's official, it's unambiguous. Their underwriting department has put a hold on the closing pending clarification of the seller's authority to convey the property." "What does that mean is happening right now?" I asked, sitting very still at my kitchen table. "It means," Patricia said, "that sometime in the next day or two, your mother is going to get a phone call from either the title company or the real estate agent, informing her that there is a serious problem with her authority to sell the property, and that the closing cannot proceed until it's resolved. And because the revocation is recorded and dated and completely valid, there is no way to resolve it, Claire. There is no path forward for her to sell that house without your explicit, current, written consent. I want to describe to you what it felt like to receive that news, because I think people imagine, in situations like this, that the moment of vindication feels triumphant, feels like a movie, some swell of orchestral music as the villain gets what's coming to them. It didn't feel like that. It felt strange and hollow and a little bit like grief, because even after everything, the phone calls, the recorded admission from my father about whatever's left, the photo of strangers on my porch, some small, stubborn, 34-year-old part of me had still been hoping, right up until that moment, that there was an explanation I hadn't considered. Some version of events where my parents weren't quite as thoughtless as the evidence suggested. That hope died completely on a Thursday evening, 2 days after Patricia's call, when my phone rang and it was my mother, and her voice was not bright and casual this time. It was sharp, and fast, and afraid. "Claire, I need you to call the title company right now and explain there's been some kind of clerical error," she said, without so much as a hello. "They're saying there's some revoked power of attorney on file, some paperwork issue, and it's holding up the whole closing, and the Castellanos are threatening to walk if we don't get this sorted by Friday, and Tyler's wedding is in 8 weeks. Claire, we do not have time for bureaucratic nonsense right now." I let a silence sit on the line for exactly as long as I needed it to, long enough that I heard my mother say, "Claire?" with the first genuine edge of uncertainty I'd heard from her in this entire ordeal. "There's no clerical error, Mom," I said. "I revoked the power of attorney 4 months ago. I had a lawyer file it with the county in June. It's a matter of public record. I did it before you ever started any of this. Before the real estate agent ever photographed my porch." The silence on her end of the line lasted so long I genuinely wondered if the call had dropped. "You did what?" she finally said, and her voice had gone very quiet, very careful, in a way I had never once heard from my mother in 34 years, because my mother did not do quiet and careful. My mother did bright and certain, always, about everything. "I revoked it in June," I repeated. "After Dad made a comment at Sunday dinner about needing to get creative with money. I had a feeling something was coming, so I went and made sure my house was protected. I didn't tell you because I wanted to see what you would actually do if you thought no one was watching." "You let us do all of this," my mother said, and I could hear something shifting in her voice now, moving from confusion toward the beginning of anger, an anger I understood was really just cornered fear wearing a familiar costume. "You let us tell the Castellanos, you let your father and I plan around this money, you let Tyler and Brianna believe the honeymoon was happening, and you just sat there smiling at us at the engagement dinner, knowing this whole time it was never going to work." "Yes," I said, and I did not apologize. And I want you to understand how significant that single unadorned word was for a woman who had spent her entire life apologizing for the crime of existing slightly less conveniently than her brother. "I let you show me exactly what you were willing to do to me, Mom. I needed to see it. I needed, just once in my life, to stop being told I was imagining things. This is insane, Claire. This is not who you are." "You're right," I said. "It's not who I was. But I think it might be who I am now." Tyler called me 40 minutes after my mother did, which told me something in itself, because 40 minutes is exactly how long it takes for a phone tree of family panic to run from a mother to a father to a golden son, each of them presumably comparing notes, trying to construct a version of events in which I was the unreasonable one. "What is wrong with you?" Tyler said, without preamble, and I could hear Brianna somewhere in the background, her voice tight and worried, saying something I couldn't quite make out. "Mom said you had this whole secret plan to sabotage the house sale. You're really going to do this to me? Over a house? You have a whole career, Claire. You make more money than practically anyone in this family. And you're going to let Brianna and me lose our honeymoon over some house you don't even need?" I sat with that for a moment, turning it over, this idea that had apparently taken root instantly and completely in my brother's mind. That my 13 years of building a career, my 6 years of saving, my 18 months on my knees sanding floors, existed as a kind of surplus resource, a rainy day fund the family could access whenever Tyler's needs became sufficiently urgent, and that my objection to this arrangement was the aberration requiring explanation rather than the arrangement itself. "Tyler," I said, keeping my voice level, "I didn't sabotage anything. I revoked a power of attorney that Mom got from me during emergency surgery 2 years ago. A document I never should have signed and that was never meant to give her authority to sell my property. I revoked it in June, before any of this started, using the completely normal, legal process for revoking a power of attorney. What happened after that wasn't sabotage. It was Mom and Dad trying to sell a house that legally wasn't theirs to sell, using authority that had already been taken away." "You could have just told them no," Tyler said, and there was a whine creeping into his voice now, the exact same register I remembered from when we were kids, and he didn't get the toy he wanted at the store. "You could have said, 'Hey, I don't want to sell my house,' instead of letting this whole thing blow up in everyone's face 3 weeks before the wedding. Mark and Jenny are freaking out. The realtor's freaking out. Mom's a wreck. And now I have to call Brianna's mother and explain why the honeymoon might not be happening. Do you understand how humiliating that is? I did tell them no, I said. I told Mom, the very first phone call, that the house wasn't hers to sell. She told me their lawyer said it was completely legal. I let the process continue because I wanted proof, in writing, of exactly what our parents were willing to do to me. Because I have spent my entire life being told that I'm too sensitive, that I'm imagining favoritism that doesn't exist, that things weren't really as unequal as they felt. I finally have proof, Tyler, and I'm not sorry I got it. There was a long pause, and when Tyler spoke again, his voice had shifted into something colder, something almost cruel, a tone I don't think I'd ever heard directed at me before. Not really. Not this nakedly. You've always been jealous of me, he said. You've always resented that people actually like me, that things come easier for me. This whole thing, this folder, this lawyer, all of it. This isn't about Mom and Dad. This is about you finally getting to feel superior to me for once in your life. I could have argued with him. I could have listed, chapter and verse, 32 years of evidence to the contrary. But I found, in that moment, that I simply didn't have the energy to relitigate a lifetime of favoritism with a man who had never once had to examine his own assumptions, because nobody had ever made him examine them. So instead, I said something that surprised even me with how calm it came out. Tyler, I hope you and Brianna have a beautiful wedding. I mean that. But I'm not paying for your honeymoon, and neither, as it turns out, are Mom and Dad, because they never actually had the money to begin with. They had my house. And my house is not for sale. I hung up before he could respond, and I sat in my quiet kitchen for a long time afterward, feeling something I hadn't expected to feel in the aftermath of that call. Not triumph, not even relief, but a kind of clean, sad clarity, the particular feeling of finally seeing, all the way to the bottom, exactly how a relationship works, after years of only ever seeing the surface. Word travels fast in a family like mine, and by that weekend I had heard from nearly every relative within a 300-mile radius, each with their own carefully calibrated opinion on what I had done, opinions that mapped, with almost perfect predictability, onto who had spent the last 3 decades benefiting from Tyler's status as the family's son around which everyone else obediently orbited. My Aunt Carol, my mother's sister, called me on Saturday morning, and I want to be fair to Aunt Carol, because she at least attempted a kind of diplomatic middle ground before landing exactly where I expected her to land. I understand you're hurt, sweetheart, she said, but don't you think there might have been a gentler way to handle this? Your mother is absolutely beside herself. She hasn't slept in days. Carol, I said. My mother tried to sell my house without asking me, using a legal document she knew, or should have known, was designed for a hospital emergency, not for funding a vacation. What would the gentler way of handling that have looked like, in your opinion? There was a pause. The sound of someone realizing the moral high ground they'd assumed was standing on was considerably softer than they'd expected. Well, I just think families should be able to work these things out without lawyers and folders and all this, Carol said, somewhat weakly. I agree, I said. Families should be able to work things out without one member secretly trying to sell another member's house. That's the part that didn't work out, Carol. I'm just the part where the consequences finally arrived. My grandmother, my father's mother, 91 years old and sharper than half the family combined, called me that same evening, and hers was the only conversation that weekend that didn't leave me feeling like I needed to take a long walk afterward. Claire, she said in the particular flat, dry voice she'd used my entire life to deliver observations nobody else in the family wanted to make out loud. Your parents have been letting that boy walk on water since the day he was born, and I've watched you clean up after every mess he's made for 30 years without a single thank you. I don't know what's in this folder of yours, and frankly, I don't need to know. But if you hadn't protected yourself, they'd have sold that roof right out from under you and called it love. Good for you. I cried after that phone call too, but it was a different kind of crying, the kind that comes after someone finally says out loud a thing you've needed to hear, confirmed by another human being for your entire life. Not everyone was so generous. My cousin Melissa, Carol's daughter, posted something vague and pointed on social media about some people caring more about money than family, which I noticed only because 3 separate relatives sent me screenshots of it within the hour, each with slightly different levels of feigned neutrality in their accompanying messages. I did not respond to the post. I did screenshot it, and I want to be honest that a part of that decision was purely emotional, a kind of petty satisfaction in documenting the pile-on, but a larger part of it was habit. At that point, the same instinct that had built the folder in the first place. If people were going to say things about me, I wanted a record of exactly what they'd said, in case the story ever needed defending later. My father, notably, did not call me that weekend. Not once. My mother called 4 more times over those 2 days, cycling through what I would later describe to Patricia as the full stages of a person realizing she'd miscalculated. First hurt bewilderment, then wounded anger. Then, by Sunday evening, something that almost resembled an actual apology, delivered in a message she left on my voicemail because I had, by that point, stopped answering. Claire, it's Mom. I've been thinking about what you said, about feeling like your needs never mattered as much as your brother's. I don't think that's fair, but I hear that you feel that way, and I'm sorry you feel that way. I really am. Can we please just sit down as a family and figure out a way forward that works for everyone? Tyler's wedding is in less than 8 weeks. Please call me back. I listened to that voicemail 3 times, parsing the specific grammar of it, the way it apologized for my feelings rather than for her actions, the way it circled straight back, within 4 sentences, to the wedding timeline, as though the primary emergency requiring resolution was still, after everything, Tyler's calendar rather than the fact that his parents had attempted to defraud a young pregnant couple and their daughter simultaneously. I did not call her back that night. Instead, I called Patricia, and I asked her a question I had been circling for days without quite letting myself land on it directly. What would it actually take, I asked, to hold them accountable? Not just tell them no. Actually hold them accountable, the way anyone else who tried this would be held accountable if they weren't my parents. Patricia was quiet for a moment, and then she said, I was wondering when you'd ask me that. Patricia laid it out for me in her office on a Tuesday morning, the same office where this had all begun 5 months earlier, and she did it the way she did everything, with a kind of unhurried clarity that made complicated things feel manageable. There are really 3 paths available to you, she said, sliding a legal pad across the desk with 3 columns already sketched out, because Patricia was the sort of lawyer who came prepared even for conversations that hadn't officially started yet. The first is that you do nothing further. The sale is already dead. It died the moment the title company found the recorded revocation. Your parents cannot sell your house. That protection already exists regardless of anything else you decide. You could simply let this be the end of it, absorb the relationship damage, and move on with your life. What's the second path? I asked. The second path is civil, she said. You could pursue your parents for the costs you've incurred, the appraisal fees they authorized without your consent, if any exist, potentially even emotional distress damages depending on how aggressively we wanted to frame it. Though I'll be honest with you, juries and even judges are often reluctant to fully monetize family disputes, even egregious ones. This path gets you some financial accountability, on paper, but it's slow, it's expensive even when you win, and it would almost certainly end your relationship with your entire family permanently and publicly, since civil suits are part of the public record too. And the third, I said. Patricia set down her pen. The third path is criminal referral. What your mother did, representing to a title company and a set of buyers that she held valid, current authority to convey your property, when she had actual notice, through the certified process we could still initiate now if you wanted, that the authority had been revoked. That could constitute attempted fraud, potentially forgery or falsification, depending on exactly what representations were made in writing to the title company and the Castellanos. I want to be very clear with you, Claire, that this is not a hypothetical scare tactic. If a stranger had done this to you, I would already have referred it to the county prosecutor's office without a second thought. The fact that it's your mother doesn't change the legal analysis. It only changes how it feels to consider it. I sat with that for a long moment, looking out Patricia's office window at the parking lot below, thinking about my mother, 63 years old, a part-time school librarian who had never in her life so much as gotten a parking ticket that I knew of, sitting in an interview room somewhere, being read her rights over a scheme to fund her son's honeymoon. I don't want her arrested, I said finally, and I want to be honest that saying it out loud felt like both a relief and a small defeat. Because some furious, 34 years tired part of me genuinely believed, in that moment, that she deserved exactly that consequence and more. I don't think that's actually what I want. I think what I want is for this to stop being deniable. I want my family to have to sit in a room and hear, out loud in front of everyone, exactly what happened, with the actual evidence in front of them, so that nobody gets to rewrite this later as some kind of misunderstanding, the way everything in my family always eventually gets rewritten. Patricia nodded slowly. Then here's what I'd suggest. We send the formal, certified notice of revocation now, something we technically could have done back in June, but held off on. We also send a formal letter, from this office, outlining the potential criminal and civil exposure your parents currently face, not as a threat to be carried out, but as a factual statement of the legal reality, so there's no ambiguity, no room for anyone to later claim they simply didn't understand what they'd done. And alongside that letter, we prepare a full accounting, every document, every recording, every text message, organized clearly enough that if you ever did want to pursue further action, you could. But more importantly, organized clearly enough that you could put it in front of your family yourself, in whatever setting you choose, and let the facts speak for themselves. The folder, I said. The folder, Patricia agreed, with the faintest trace of a smile. Consider it the definitive edition. I left her office that afternoon with a stack of paper an inch and a half thick, everything organized behind labeled tabs: the original power of attorney, the recorded revocation, the title company's hold notice, transcripts of the calls I'd recorded, screenshots of texts, a formal letter from Patricia's office outlining the legal exposure in language precise enough that no lawyer my parents hired would be able to talk them out of understanding it. I drove home and sat at my kitchen table, and I called my mother back for the first time in 4 days. I want to have Thanksgiving at my house this year, I told her. All of us. You, Dad, Tyler, Brianna. I think it's time we talked about everything, together, as a family, instead of over the phone in pieces. There was a long pause, and then my mother, sounding cautiously, tentatively hopeful for the first time since this had all started, said, "I would really like that, Claire. I think that's a wonderful idea." She had no idea what she was agreeing to. I spent the 2 weeks before Thanksgiving doing something I hadn't expected to find so calming, cleaning my house, top to bottom, the house that had nearly been sold out from under me to strangers, the house Mark and Jenny Castellano had briefly, unknowingly, almost purchased. I refinished a scuff on the porch railing. I polished the oak floors I'd sanded by hand 2 years earlier. I want to tell you honestly that there was something almost ceremonial in this cleaning, some part of me preparing a stage, because I knew, with total certainty, exactly what was going to happen at that table. And I wanted my family to sit inside the actual physical proof of what they had tried to take from me while I told them. I called Mark and Jenny Castellano myself during that time, something Patricia hadn't required of me, but that felt necessary regardless. I found their number through the real estate agent, who was, understandably, eager to distance her brokerage from the entire situation once the title issue became clear. I told Jenny, gently, that I was sorry for what had happened, that the house had never actually been available to sell, that I hoped they'd understand it wasn't personal and wasn't in any way their fault. Jenny cried a little on the phone, told me they'd already picked out paint colors for the nursery, and I felt a fresh wave of anger at my parents that had nothing to do with me at all. Anger on behalf of two strangers who had been swept into my family's dysfunction through no fault of their own. I told her, before we hung up, that if they were still house hunting in the spring, I'd be glad to let them know if I ever heard of anything else in the neighborhood. It felt like the smallest possible repair for a situation my family had created, but it was something, and something mattered. I also spent those 2 weeks talking with Patricia about exactly how I wanted Thanksgiving to go, because I did not want it to become a shouting match. Did not want it to devolve into the kind of chaotic, everyone talking over everyone family blow-up that would leave nothing settled and everything more entrenched than before. I wanted it structured. I wanted it calm. I wanted, more than anything, for there to be no room left afterward for anyone to claim they hadn't understood. Consider writing out what you want to say, Patricia suggested. Not a script exactly, but a clear order of what you're going to present and in what sequence. People in shock or shame will try to interrupt, to derail, to change the subject to their feelings about how you're delivering the information rather than the information itself. Having a clear structure helps you hold the floor. I took her advice seriously. I sat at my kitchen table 3 nights in a row, writing and rewriting what I wanted to say, organizing the folder, the actual, physical, $4 blue folder, now grown thick with its final additions, into a sequence that told the story the way I needed it told. First, the power of attorney and its revocation, dated and undeniable. Then the timeline of the attempted sale, month by month. Then the recordings and texts, my father's voice explaining that I'd get whatever's left. My mother's cheerful photo of strangers on my porch. Then, finally, Patricia's letter, outlining in careful legal language exactly what my parents had actually done, in terms a court would recognize, even if a family dinner table never had before. I did not invite my grandmother. I want to explain that choice, because it might seem strange given how much her support had meant to me. But this dinner wasn't about assembling allies or building a jury of relatives to witness my parents' humiliation. It was about the 4 people who had actually been in the arithmetic together, my parents, my brother, and me, sitting at a table and finally, for the first time in our family's history, dealing in facts instead of feelings, in documents instead of decades of vague, deniable favoritism. The night before Thanksgiving, I laid the folder on the small table by my front door, where I would be able to pick it up and carry it to the dining room at the right moment. And I stood there for a long time looking at it, this unremarkable object that had become, over 5 months, the single most consequential thing I had ever created. I thought about the version of myself who had bought this house 6 years earlier, exhausted and hopeful, crying in the driveway before she even had the key in her hand. I thought about all the years before that, the DUI reframed as growth, the art history semester dismissed as self-indulgence, the quiet arithmetic of whose needs counted as needs. Tomorrow, I thought, standing in my hallway on the eve of Thanksgiving, they are going to understand, finally, completely, without any room left for doubt, exactly what they have been doing to me for 34 years. And I am going to be the one who shows them. I went to bed early that night, and for the first time in 5 months, I slept straight through until morning. They arrived at 2 in the afternoon, my parents first, then Tyler and Brianna 20 minutes later, and I watched all four of them walk up the porch steps I had rebuilt with my own hands, past the swing I had installed, into the house they had tried to sell out from under me, and I felt something settle in my chest, some final piece clicking into place. The dinner itself for the first hour was almost unbearably normal. My mother complimented the turkey, which I had actually made myself for the first time in my life instead of ordering catering, because I wanted this dinner, in every sense, to be entirely mine. Brianna showed me pictures on her phone of dresses she was considering for the bridal shower. My father made a comment about the Ohio State game that was playing quietly in the background, and Tyler laughed at something and reached for a second helping of stuffing. And if you had walked in off the street and seen us sitting there, you would have seen an ordinary family having an ordinary holiday, and you would have had no idea that under the table, resting against my chair leg, sat a blue folder that was about to end that illusion permanently. I waited until the plates were mostly empty, until my mother had started, almost on cue, to make the small gestures of a woman preparing to clear the table and move things along toward dessert and, inevitably, toward the wedding logistics that had consumed every family conversation for months. I waited until that exact moment, and then I said, "Before we do dessert, I want to talk about something. I want everyone to stay at the table for this." My mother's hands paused over a stack of plates. "Claire, honey, can it wait until after?" "No," I said, gently but with a firmness that made her set the plates back down. "It can't. It's about the house. And I need all four of you to hear it together. The same way, at the same time. So that later, nobody can say they weren't told, or that they misunderstood, or that it wasn't really as bad as I'm making it sound. I need this to happen once, clearly, in front of everyone." I felt the temperature in the room change. Tyler set down his fork. Brianna glanced between him and me, uncertain, clearly sensing she had wandered into a family current far deeper than the one she'd signed up for. My father's jaw tightened in the particular way it did whenever a conversation threatened to move somewhere he didn't want it to go. I reached down and picked up the folder. "I'm going to walk through what actually happened this year," I said, opening it to the first tab. "Not what any of us remember or how any of us have been telling this story to relatives. What actually happened, documented." I laid the first page on the table, a copy of the power of attorney I'd signed in the pre-op room 2 years earlier, and beside it, the recorded revocation, dated in June, 5 full months before the sale process ever began. "This is the document Mom used to authorize a sale of my house, and this," I tapped the second page, "is proof that I revoked that authority in June, before any real estate agent ever set foot on my property, before any offer was made, before any of this happened. It's a matter of public record. Anyone, a title company, a lawyer, a court, can verify this in about 10 minutes. "Claire," my mother started, her voice tight. "I don't think we need to—" "I'm not finished," I said, and something in my voice must have carried more weight than I expected, because she stopped. I laid down the next page, a printed screenshot of the photo my mother had sent me of Mark and Jenny Castellano standing on my porch. Brianna had gone very pale. Tyler was staring at the table. I laid down the transcript next, the one from my father's call. "This is a transcript of a call Dad made to me, where he explained that I would receive, quote, whatever's left, after the honeymoon, the venue deposit, and the wedding photographer were paid for out of the sale of my own house." I looked at my father as I said it, and for the first time in this entire ordeal, I saw something in his face that looked less like defensiveness and more like the beginning of genuine shame. And this, I said, laying down the final page, a copy of Patricia's letter, is a letter from my attorney outlining the legal exposure everyone at this table currently faces, because what happened this year was not a misunderstanding between family members. It was an attempt to sell property that legally belonged to me, using authority that had already been revoked, to buyers who were never told the truth about the situation. Depending on how it's characterized, that could constitute fraud. My attorney has told me, in plain terms, that if a stranger had done this to me, it would already be in front of the county prosecutor. The silence that followed was the kind of silence I don't think our family had ever actually experienced before. Not once, in 34 years of holiday dinners and small comparisons and quiet erasures. Nobody reached for stuffing. Nobody mentioned the Ohio State game. My father spoke first, which surprised me, because my father almost never spoke first about anything emotionally difficult. That had always been my mother's territory, with him nodding along in agreement behind her. "Claire," he said, and his voice had none of its usual steadiness. "We didn't think of it that way. We really didn't. We thought your mother had power of attorney. We thought that meant we had the right to make this decision. We thought, honestly, that you'd understand. Eventually, that we needed to help your brother." "You thought I'd understand," I repeated. "That funding a $60,000 honeymoon by selling my house without asking me was something I would eventually be okay with." "When you say it like that," my mother started, and I actually laughed, a short, surprised, humorless sound, because there it was, the exact reflex I'd expected, the instinct to find some gentler framing that made the fact sound less bad, even now, even with the paper trail sitting directly in front of her on the table. "There is no other way to say it, Mom," I said. "That's what happened. I'm not editorializing. Everything on this table is a document or a recording. This is what you actually did. In your own words. On tape." Tyler finally looked up from the table, and his face had gone through several expressions in the last 10 minutes, but the one that settled there now was something I hadn't expected. Not defiance, not the wounded entitlement I'd heard on the phone weeks earlier, but something closer to genuine, dawning horror, the look of a man realizing, perhaps for the first time in his adult life, that the ground beneath him had never actually been as solid as he'd assumed. "Mom," he said quietly, "you told me the money for the honeymoon was coming from your retirement accounts. You told me you and Dad had been saving for years for this." My mother's face went white. "You lied to him too," I said, and I felt something in me that was almost, unexpectedly, sad on Tyler's behalf, because whatever grievances I carried about 34 years of favoritism, watching my brother's face crumble in real time as he understood that his own parents had lied to him about the foundation of his wedding gift was not something I had actually wanted to witness. I had wanted my parents to be accountable to me. I hadn't fully anticipated what it would look like for Tyler to finally see the same machinery I'd been watching my entire life, except aimed, for once, at him. "I didn't lie," my mother said weakly. I didn't want you to worry about where the money was coming from. I wanted you to enjoy your wedding without stress." "You wanted me to enjoy my wedding without stress," Tyler repeated, his voice rising now. "By stealing my sister's house and lying to me about it?" "Nobody stole anything," my father said. But even as he said it, I could see he didn't fully believe it anymore, that the word had curdled somewhere between his throat and the air, because there, on the table, in black and white, was proof that they had attempted exactly that. I let the silence sit for a moment before I said what I had come to say, the actual point of the entire evening, the thing I had rehearsed alone in my kitchen for 3 nights running. "I'm not here to destroy this family," I said. "I'm not calling the county prosecutor. I'm not suing anyone. I could. My attorney has made clear that I could, and that I would very likely win, both in criminal exposure and civil damages. But that's not actually what I want. And I've thought about this for months now, long enough to be sure it's not what I want. I looked at each of them in turn: my mother, my father, my brother, Brianna sitting frozen and pale beside him. What I want, I said, is for this to be the last time in my life that my needs are treated as a resource for solving Tyler's problems. I want an actual apology, not the kind where you apologize for how I feel, but the kind where you apologize for what you did. I want you to pay Mark and Jenny Castellano back whatever costs they incurred looking at a house that was never actually for sale, the appraisal, any deposits, anything they lost in this. And I want it understood, permanently, starting tonight, that my house, my savings, my career, and my life are not communal family property to be redistributed whenever Tyler's dreams cost more than his own resources can cover. Nobody said anything for a long moment, and then my father, in a voice I had never once heard him use in 34 years, a voice with no defensiveness left in it at all, said, "You're right. We're sorry, Claire. We're actually sorry." And my mother, crying now, quietly, without the performance I half expected, said, "I don't know how to fix 30 years in one dinner, but I want to try. I really do want to try." I didn't cry at that table. I want to be honest that some part of me had expected to, had imagined this moment for months as some kind of emotional release. But what I actually felt, sitting there surrounded by the wreckage of an illusion my family had maintained my entire life, was something quieter and more durable than relief. I felt, for the first time I could remember, believed. The weeks after Thanksgiving were strange in a way I hadn't fully prepared for, because I had spent so much energy imagining the confrontation itself that I hadn't thought as carefully about what came after. The slow, awkward, often clumsy process of a family trying to rebuild something honest out of the wreckage of something that had never actually been honest to begin with. Tyler called me the week after Thanksgiving, and it was a different kind of call than any we'd had before. Hesitant in a way my brother had never once been hesitant with me in his entire life. "I've been thinking a lot," he said, "about some stuff. About us. About how things have always been between us, actually. Not just this year." He paused for a long time, long enough that I wondered if he'd hung up. "I think I always just believed the version of things Mom and Dad told me. That you were the strong one who didn't need anything, and I was the one who needed help. I never really thought about what that meant for you. I'm sorry." I told him I appreciated that, and I meant it, though I also told him, gently, that an apology over the phone didn't erase 32 years of pattern, that it was a start, not an ending, and that I needed to see it become an actual pattern of behavior before I fully believed it. And he said quietly that he understood that, and that he was willing to be patient while I figured out whether I could trust it. The honeymoon, predictably, changed shape entirely. The $60,000 Maldives package was canceled, most of the deposit lost, which became its own painful lesson for Tyler and Brianna about the actual cost of dreams versus the actual size of their bank account. Brianna, to her credit, handled the disappointment with more grace than I expected, and I learned later, through Tyler, that she had been quietly uncomfortable for months about how much money her in-laws seemed to be spending on things they clearly couldn't afford, and that some part of her had been relieved, even amid the humiliation, that the whole situation had finally come out into the open instead of continuing to accumulate in the dark. They ended up taking a much smaller trip instead, a week in the Outer Banks, paid for almost entirely by money they'd saved themselves over 4 months of genuinely disciplined budgeting, the first sustained financial discipline I had ever personally witnessed from my brother in his adult life. Tyler texted me a photo from the beach during that trip, grinning, sunburned, holding Brianna's hand, with a caption that read simply, "Not the Maldives, but it's ours. Thank you for making us actually figure this out ourselves." I saved that text too, though for entirely different reasons than everything else I'd saved that year. The wedding itself happened in January, smaller and simpler than my mother had originally planned, scaled back once my parents finally sat down and confronted the actual state of their finances. A conversation I understand was its own difficult reckoning, separate from anything involving me, about years of quietly overspending on Tyler's behalf while telling themselves it was manageable. I attended the wedding. I gave a short toast, careful and warm, about hoping Tyler and Brianna's marriage would be built on the kind of honesty ours family had spent 34 years avoiding. A line that made my mother cry in a way I understood. Watching her was not entirely about happiness. I want to be honest that the wedding was not entirely comfortable for me. There is a particular strangeness in standing in a room celebrating your brother's marriage while carrying the very recent memory of nearly losing your house to fund it. And I would be lying if I told you every part of that day felt resolved. But it also felt in a way I hadn't expected, like a genuine turning point rather than a continuation, the first family event in my adult life where I did not feel invisible, where I did not feel like the load-bearing wall nobody thanked for holding up the house. Brianna hugged me at the reception, unprompted, and said quietly, "I know this year was really hard because of us, even though it wasn't really about us. I'm glad you stood up for yourself. I don't think I would have known how." I told her I hoped she never had to find out the hard way, the way I had, and she squeezed my hand and went back to the dance floor, back to my brother, who was, for once, watching his own wedding unfold, rather than watching to see whether it measured up to what everyone else expected of him. My parents' reckoning took longer, and it took a different shape than Tyler's, because unlike my brother, who had at least been an unwitting beneficiary of a scheme he hadn't designed, my mother and father had to sit with the fact that they had been the architects of something they now had to actively repair, piece by piece, in ways that couldn't simply be apologized away over a phone call. The first piece was the Castellanos. My father called Mark Castellano directly, a call I know about only because Mark mentioned it to me months later when I ran into him and Jenny at a farmer's market downtown, both of them pushing a stroller with their new daughter fast asleep inside it. My father apologized, formally, and offered to cover the appraisal fee and the small deposit they'd already put down before the sale collapsed, along with an additional sum meant, I think, as much to ease his own conscience as to genuinely compensate them for the disruption. Mark told me it wasn't a huge amount of money, but that the apology itself had mattered more, that it was the difference between feeling like they'd been scammed by strangers and feeling like they'd been caught in the middle of a family situation that had nothing to do with them and had been handled, eventually, with some measure of integrity. The second piece was harder and slower, and it involved my parents finally confronting the actual state of their own finances, something I understand from occasional updates my mother has shared with me since they had been avoiding examining honestly for years. It turned out the home equity line of credit they'd taken out for the wedding photographer and part of the venue deposit was larger than either of them had fully processed, a debt they'd been servicing quietly while continuing to describe themselves, at every family dinner, as people who were simply being generous rather than people who were, in fact, financially overextended in service of an image of generosity they couldn't actually sustain. My mother told me, on a phone call in early spring, that she and my father had started seeing a financial counselor, something that would have been unthinkable to either of them a year earlier, admitting to a stranger that their spending didn't match their income. "I think," she said in a voice that sounded older and more tired than I'd ever heard from her, That we spent so many years telling ourselves we were doing the right thing for Tyler that we never actually stopped to ask whether we could afford to keep doing it, or whether it was actually helping him, or whether it was costing you something we never bothered to notice. I told her I appreciated her saying that, and I did, genuinely, though I also told her, as gently as I could manage, that noticing it now, after 34 years, didn't erase the cost. It just meant the cost stopped compounding. She was quiet for a moment and then said, "That's fair. I'm not asking you to pretend it does. I'm just telling you, I finally see it." The third piece, and the one that took the longest, was rebuilding an actual working relationship with me, one that didn't rely on the old, unspoken family currency of my compliance in exchange for occasional approval. This looked, in practice, like small things at first. My mother asking me actual questions about my job, my life, my own plans, rather than steering every conversation back toward Tyler within 4 sentences. My father calling me, unprompted, on my birthday that year, something he had genuinely never done before in my adult life, to simply say he was proud of me, without attaching it to any comparison, any qualifier, any mention of my brother at all. I want to be honest that I did not fully trust any of this at first. I had spent 34 years learning that my family's good behavior tended to be situational, a performance calibrated to whatever crisis was currently unfolding, and I watched that spring and summer with the same careful, analytical attention I brought to reviewing a company's financials before recommending an investment, looking not at what they said in any single moment, but at the pattern over time, the actual data, rather than the narrative. The pattern held. Not perfectly. There were still moments, small ones, where old habits surfaced, a comment from my mother about Tyler's new promotion that briefly forgot to ask about my own recent work, a flash of the old reflexive centering that I gently, firmly, learned to name out loud rather than swallow silently the way I always had before. But the difference now was that when I named it, my mother actually heard it, actually adjusted, rather than defending the old arithmetic as though it were simply how families worked. I want to tell you about the year that followed, because I think it matters just as much as the confrontation itself, maybe more, since it's easy to imagine that opening a folder at a Thanksgiving dinner is the climax of a story like this, the dramatic peak after which everything simply resolves. The truth is that the folder was only the moment the truth became undeniable. What actually changed my life was everything I did afterward. The slow work of building a life that no longer had room in it for the old arithmetic. The first thing I did, that following January, was go back to Patricia's office and do something I probably should have done years earlier regardless of any of this. I set up a proper estate plan, a revocable living trust that held the house and my other major assets, with clear, explicit, written instructions about who had authority over what and under precisely what circumstances. Patricia and I joked, a little grimly, that I had accidentally become one of her most thorough clients purely out of necessity, and she told me, only half joking, that she wished every client came to her with the same clear-eyed understanding of exactly why these documents mattered. I also did something I hadn't expected to do, which was start volunteering, once a month, with a legal aid clinic that helped elderly and vulnerable people understand the powers of attorney and estate documents they were often pressured into signing without fully grasping the implications, sometimes by well-meaning family members, and sometimes by people whose intentions were considerably less well-meaning than my mother's had been. I sat with strangers in small conference rooms and explained, in plain language, what a durable power of attorney actually meant, how to revoke one, why it mattered to review these documents periodically rather than letting them sit forgotten in a filing cabinet for years. I found something quietly healing in it, taking the worst thing that had ever happened to me and turning it into a kind of literacy I could hand to other people before it cost them what it had almost cost me. My career, which had already been steady and successful before any of this began, took an unexpected turn that spring when I was asked to lead a new division at my firm focused on family wealth transition planning, helping families navigate exactly the kind of financial complexity that, in my own family, had been handled through silence, favoritism, and a folder in a filing cabinet, instead of through honest conversation and proper documentation. I like to think there is a certain poetry in that the thing which almost destroyed my relationship with my family became, professionally, the thing I became genuinely excellent at helping other families avoid. I also, that summer, met someone. His name is Daniel, and I want to tell you about him not because this is a love story, exactly, but because of something he said to me on our third date, when I told him, somewhat nervously, an abbreviated version of what had happened with my house the previous year. He listened to the whole thing quietly, and when I finished, he didn't say anything about how crazy my family sounded, or offer some easy, generic sympathy. He said, "It sounds like you spent your whole life being the reliable one, and nobody ever noticed that reliable people need to be able to rely on someone too." I remember sitting across from him in that restaurant thinking, this is the first time in longer than I can remember that someone has understood the actual shape of what happened to me without me having to explain every piece of it first. Daniel and I have been together for a year and a half now. He has been to Thanksgiving at my house twice, sitting at the same table where I laid out that folder, and both times, the dinner was ordinary in the very best sense of the word. Turkey, mild disagreements about politics, my mother asking him genuine questions about his job, my father telling the same 3 stories about his own father that he's told at every holiday for as long as I can remember, and nobody, not once, mentioning money or fairness or who deserved what. About a year and a half after that Thanksgiving, life handed me an unplanned test of exactly how much had actually changed, and I want to tell you about it because I think it's the part of this story that matters most, more than the folder itself, more than the confrontation because anyone can have one good, dramatic conversation. What determines whether real change happened is what occurs the next time the old pressure returns. Tyler lost his sales job that spring, a casualty of a company-wide restructuring that had nothing to do with his performance, genuinely not his fault, the kind of layoff that happens to steady, competent people through no failing of their own. He called me, and I could hear in his voice an old, familiar anxiety, the anxiety of a man who had spent his entire life being rescued and had no practiced muscle for handling a crisis any other way. "I don't know what we're going to do," he said. "Brianna's still finishing her degree. We've got the mortgage on the condo, and I don't want to ask Mom and Dad, I really don't. Not after everything, but I don't know where else to turn." I felt in that moment the old gravitational pull of the family pattern reasserting itself, the familiar shape of a crisis forming around Tyler that everyone else was implicitly expected to help absorb. And I want to be honest that some old, tired part of me almost slid automatically into the well-worn groove of offering to help financially, because that groove had been carved so deep over 3 decades that my instinct still knew its exact contours even after everything that had happened. Instead, I asked him a question. What do you actually need right now? Not what feels comfortable to ask for. What do you actually need? He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, "I think I need help updating my resume, and maybe some advice on how to talk about the layoff in interviews without sounding defensive about it. And honestly, I think I just need someone to tell me it's going to be okay without also handing me a check, because I think that's the first time in my life anyone's ever done that." So that's what I did. I spent 2 Saturday afternoons with him at my kitchen table, the same table where the folder once sat, going through his resume line by line, helping him translate 3 years of sales experience into language that would land with hiring managers, running through interview questions until he stopped sounding rehearsed and started sounding like himself. I did not offer him money, and notably, he did not ask for it, and I understood, watching him work through that process with a kind of focused determination I'd genuinely never seen from him before, that something in him had shifted too, not just in how our parents treated him, but in how he understood his own capacity to handle hard things without a safety net catching him before he even hit the ground. He found a new job within 10 weeks, a better one actually, at a company that valued the skills he'd spent years underselling because he'd never had to sell himself before. He'd only ever had to be charming enough that other people did the selling for him. He called me the day he got the offer, and there was something in his voice I hadn't heard before, a kind of pride that belonged entirely to him, that hadn't been manufactured or supplied by anyone else's rescue. "I did that myself," he said, and I could hear him almost marveling at the sentence as he said it. "I actually did that myself." "You did," I told him. "You always could have. Nobody ever gave you the chance to find out." My parents, for their part, called me during that same period, and I braced myself, half expecting the old pattern, some request that I quietly help cover Tyler's mortgage while he job hunted, dressed up in the language of family solidarity. Instead, my mother said, "We wanted to ask you what you thought, before we said anything to Tyler ourselves. Your father and I talked about offering to help with his mortgage for a couple months, but we wanted to check with you first, given everything, to make sure that felt okay, and not like we were falling back into old patterns." I sat with that for a moment, genuinely surprised, and then I told her honestly that I thought a short, clearly bounded offer of help during a genuine job loss was different in kind from selling a sibling's house to fund a honeymoon, that the difference wasn't really about dollar amounts, it was about consent, honesty, and proportion. She thanked me for talking it through with her, and I understood, hanging up the phone, that this, being asked, being consulted, being treated as a person whose perspective mattered rather than a resource to be allocated, was the actual repair I had been working toward all along. I want to tell you about my grandmother, because she died that autumn, quietly, in her sleep, at 92, and her death became its own strange, unexpected coda to everything that had happened over the previous 2 years. A final lesson from the one person in my family who had always seen the actual shape of things clearly, even when nobody else would say it out loud. At her funeral, my father gave the eulogy, and near the end of it, he said something that surprised me, something he hadn't run past me or my mother beforehand, judging by the way my mother's hand tightened on mine when he said it. "My mother told me something a few years ago that I didn't want to hear at the time," he said, standing at the podium in the small Methodist church where I'd spent my childhood Sundays. "She told me that a parent who only shows up for the child who's struggling teaches the steady child that steadiness is invisible." I didn't understand what she meant until my daughter Claire showed me, in the hardest way possible, exactly how right her grandmother had been. I hadn't known my grandmother had said that to him. I sat in that pew, holding Daniel's hand on one side and my mother's on the other, and I cried in a way I hadn't allowed myself to cry during any part of the ordeal with the house, because it wasn't grief exactly. Or not only grief. It was the strange, overwhelming relief of understanding that somewhere, quietly, without my ever knowing it, someone in my family had been fighting for me the entire time, even when I felt utterly alone in it. After the service, my grandmother's lawyer read her will, and I learned that she had left a specific bequest to me, a modest sum of money along with a handwritten note that the lawyer read aloud, because my grandmother, apparently, had wanted it read to the whole family, not just to me privately. The note said, To Claire, who spent her whole life holding up the roof without anyone thanking her for it. This isn't a reward. It's just what should have always been fair. Use it for something that's entirely yours. I used part of that money to finally build the screened-in porch addition I'd been dreaming about since the day I bought the house on Larkspur Lane. The one thing on my original renovation list I'd never gotten around to because I always told myself there wasn't quite enough money left over after everything else. I finished it the following spring, and I sat in it on the first warm evening, looking out at the yard, thinking about 6 years of saving, 18 months of renovation, one terrifying autumn of nearly losing everything, and one grandmother who had apparently seen the whole pattern clearly enough to name it to my father before either of us fully understood it ourselves. Daniel proposed to me on that new screened-in porch, 18 months after we'd started dating, on an ordinary Tuesday evening rather than some elaborately staged occasion, which I appreciated more than I can properly explain, because after a lifetime of watching my family perform generosity and celebration for an audience, there was something deeply moving about a proposal that existed for no one but the two of us. We got married the following June, in my backyard, under a tent my father and Tyler helped assemble the weekend before. The two of them working together with a kind of easy, uncomplicated cooperation that would have seemed impossible to imagine 3 years earlier. My mother helped me get dressed that morning, and at one point, adjusting the buttons on the back of my gown, she started crying, and when I asked her what was wrong, she said, "I just keep thinking about how close I came to losing you over money that was never even really mine to spend. I don't know how to thank you for giving me the chance to fix it instead of just walking away, which you would have been completely justified in doing." I told her the truth, which was that I had thought seriously about walking away in the months after that Thanksgiving, that there had been entire weeks where I genuinely believed the relationship wasn't salvageable and might not be worth trying to salvage. What had changed my mind wasn't a single dramatic gesture from her or my father. It was the slow accumulation, month after month, of small, consistent evidence that the pattern had actually shifted, that being asked instead of assumed upon had become the new baseline rather than an occasional exception. Tyler gave a toast at the reception that surprised nearly everyone in the room, because Tyler had never, in his entire life, been asked to be the emotionally articulate one at a family gathering. That role had always unofficially belonged to me. He stood up, visibly nervous, and said, "My sister spent our whole childhood being the person everyone could count on, and for a long time, I thought that meant she didn't need anyone to count on her back. I was wrong about that, and I'm grateful every day that she found a way to make all of us understand it before it was too late." He looked at me, and I looked at him, and for the first time in 36 years, I did not feel a single ounce of the old comparison humming underneath the moment, the old arithmetic of whose feelings counted more. There was just my brother, imperfect and still working on himself, genuinely trying and genuinely proud of me without qualification. Brianna, 7 months pregnant with their first child by then, hugged me afterward and said, "I hope our kid grows up watching how you and Tyler figured this out, instead of growing up the way you two did." I told her I hoped so too, and I meant it more than she probably realized. I've had a lot of time to think about all of this, in the years since that Thanksgiving, and I want to share some of what I've come to understand, because I suspect some of you reading this recognize pieces of your own family in mine, and I think it matters to name clearly what actually happened, psychologically, underneath all the specifics of houses and honeymoons and folders. Favoritism in families rarely announces itself. Almost nobody sits their children down and says, explicitly, "I love one of you more than the other," or "your needs matter less than your siblings." It operates instead through 1,000 small allocations of attention and forgiveness and resource. each one so minor on its own that it can always be explained away, always rationalized as a response to circumstance rather than a pattern of preference. Tyler needed more help because he struggled more. I needed less help because I managed fine on my own. Stated that way, it sounds almost reasonable, even virtuous. Help the one who's struggling. It took me 34 years to understand the flaw hiding inside that logic. When a family only extends care to the child who is struggling, it teaches the other child that competence is a kind of exile, that managing your own problems well is quietly punished with neglect, and that the only reliable way to receive love and attention is to eventually need saving yourself. I don't think my parents ever consciously decided to love Tyler more than they loved me. I genuinely believe, even now, that if you'd asked either of them directly, during any point in my childhood, whether they loved their children equally, they would have answered yes without a flicker of hesitation, and they would have meant it. That's what makes this particular kind of family dynamic so difficult to name and so difficult to escape. It isn't hypocrisy, exactly. It's a blind spot, built up over decades, reinforced by every small moment where helping the visibly struggling child felt urgent and helping the quietly capable child felt optional, until an entire family's operating system had been constructed around an asymmetry nobody ever chose on purpose and almost nobody could see clearly from the inside. What finally broke through it, in my family's case, wasn't feelings. It was documents. It was a dated, recorded, legally unambiguous piece of paper that made 34 years of vague, deniable favoritism suddenly undeniable, specific, quantifiable in dollars and dates and signatures. I think about that a lot. How my entire life of feeling unequally treated could be dismissed, gently but completely, as oversensitivity, as misremembering, as simply not understanding how much Tyler struggled, until the exact same pattern showed up as a line item on a legal document, and suddenly, finally, nobody in my family could argue with it anymore. I don't think everyone in a situation like mine needs a folder, exactly, or a lawyer, or a recorded phone call. Not every family imbalance rises to the level of attempted fraud. Most families' favoritism just quietly accumulates, unresolved, for entire lifetimes, without ever crossing into anything a court would recognize. But I do think the underlying lesson generalizes further than my specific circumstances. If you are the reliable one in your family, the one who manages, the one who doesn't need saving, it is worth asking yourself honestly whether that reliability has ever actually been protected, or whether it has simply been assumed, quietly, as an inexhaustible resource available to everyone else. And if the answer is that it's been assumed rather than protected, I want to tell you what I wish someone had told me 20 years earlier. Your steadiness is not evidence that you don't need anything. It is not a permission slip for people to take from you without asking, simply because you have proven, over and over, that you can absorb the loss without complaint. Being capable does not mean you are required to be endlessly available. Being the one who doesn't need saving does not mean you have opted out of deserving to be protected. I want to go back, briefly, to the practical aftermath of that Thanksgiving, because I think the unglamorous procedural parts of this story matter too, and I don't want to skip past them in favor of only the emotional beats, because in my experience, real resolution is made of both. In the weeks after that dinner, Patricia and I formalized everything we'd discussed at that table into an actual written agreement, not because I distrusted my parents' sincerity in the moment, but because I had learned, the hard way, the difference between a heartfelt promise made at a dinner table and a commitment that survives contact with ordinary life 6 months later. My parents signed a letter, drafted by Patricia, formally and permanently acknowledging that the power of attorney had been properly revoked, that they had no further claim of any kind to my property or assets, and that any future financial arrangement between us would require my explicit written consent. It felt strange, honestly, having my own parents sign something so formal, so legalistic. But Patricia told me something that stuck with me. A relationship that's healthy enough to survive clear boundaries in writing is a relationship worth having. One that can't survive them was never as stable as it looked. My parents also followed through, over the following several months, on repaying the Castellanos for their incurred costs, the appraisal fee, a home inspection they'd already paid for, a small amount toward a moving truck deposit they'd put down prematurely in anticipation of a closing that was never actually going to happen. It wasn't a large sum in absolute terms, a little over $2,000 altogether, but I understood, watching my father write that check, that the amount mattered less than the act itself, the formal, documented acknowledgement that real people outside our family had been harmed by what had happened, and that harm required actual repair, not just an apology delivered privately within the family where no one else would ever know. I also want to tell you what happened to the folder itself, because I think it matters as a kind of final image. I didn't destroy it. I didn't burn it dramatically in the backyard fire pit, satisfying as that image might be in a movie version of this story. I put it in a fireproof lockbox in my new home office, alongside the estate planning documents Patricia and I had built together, not as a weapon to hold over my family's head forever, but as a simple, practical record. The same way you'd keep any other important legal document, filed away, hopefully never needed again, but there, permanently, in case it ever was. I think that's actually the truest thing I can tell you about accountability within a family. It isn't usually a single explosive moment, however satisfying that moment might feel when it finally arrives. It's the boring, unglamorous work that comes after. The signed letters, the repaid debts, the small consistent choices made over months and years that either confirm or contradict what was said at the dinner table. The folder got me to the table. What happened in the 2 years after the folder is what actually determined whether my family survived what I put in it. Brianna went into labor on a humid morning in August, 3 weeks after my own wedding, and Tyler called me from the hospital hallway sounding more overwhelmed and more genuinely present than I had ever heard him sound in his entire life. "She's here," he said, his voice cracking. "We named her Grace. Claire, I want you to be the first person outside the two of us to hold her, if that's okay. I want her to know you were there from the beginning." I drove to the hospital that afternoon with Daniel, and I sat in a small chair beside Brianna's bed, and Tyler placed his daughter in my arms, this impossibly small, impossibly new person, and I remember looking down at her tiny, unformed face and thinking about the version of myself who had once sat in a hospital pre-op room, frightened and about to go under anesthesia, signing a document that would eventually cost me almost everything I'd built. I thought about how strange it was that the same family that had produced that betrayal had also somehow produced this small, perfect moment, this new person who would grow up, I hoped, without ever having to learn the lesson I'd had to learn the hard way. "I want to ask you something," Tyler said, as I sat there holding Grace, and there was a seriousness in his voice that made me look up. "Brianna and I talked about it, and we want to name you as Grace's godmother, not just as a formality. We want you to actually be someone she can come to, someone who'll tell her the truth even when it's not the easy thing to say. We want her to grow up with someone in this family who models what it looks like to stand up for yourself." I said yes, obviously, and I held that baby a little tighter, and I made a private promise to her, silently, that I would never let her grow up believing her needs mattered less than anyone else's simply because she happened to be easier to overlook. I thought about my grandmother's note, that this isn't a reward, it's just what should have always been fair. And I understood, holding my niece for the first time, that some part of what I'd fought for over the previous 2 years had never really been just for me. It had been for whoever came next in this family, so that the pattern might actually break instead of simply repeating itself one more painful generation down the line. My mother, watching from the doorway of the hospital room, wiped her eyes and said quietly, mostly to herself, "I hope I get to do this differently with her than I did it with you two." I told her that she still had time to try, and that trying, actually trying, consistently, over years rather than moments, was the only thing any of us could really offer each other at this point. She nodded, and came and sat beside me, and looked down at her granddaughter, and for a long moment, none of us said anything at all, because there wasn't really anything left that needed saying. The division I built at my firm, the one focused on family wealth transition planning, grew faster than anyone expected, and I found myself, somewhat to my own surprise, becoming something of a quiet specialist in exactly the kind of situation that had nearly destroyed my own family. Cases where aging parents held informal or outdated financial authority over adult children's assets, where favoritism between siblings had calcified into genuine financial risk, where nobody had ever bothered to update a power of attorney signed hastily during some long-forgotten medical emergency. I started giving talks, first just internally at my firm, then at local community centers, then eventually at small regional conferences, always some version of the same core message. Review your legal documents periodically, understand exactly what authority you've granted to whom, and do not assume that family love makes formal boundaries unnecessary. I never used my own name in those talks, not directly, not in a way that would have been recognizable to anyone who didn't already know the story, but I always included, somewhere in the presentation, a case study I described only as a client whose family had attempted to sell her home using an outdated power of attorney, and I always watched the room carefully during that part, because I could tell every single time that at least a few people in the audience recognized something uncomfortably close to their own family in the details. A woman came up to me after one of those talks, maybe 8 months after I'd started giving them, and she was shaking slightly, and she said, "That case study, did that actually happen to someone, or is it hypothetical?" I told her it happened to someone real, and she said, very quietly, "I think it might be about to happen to me. My mother has power of attorney from when I had cancer treatment 3 years ago, and I just found out she's been talking to a realtor about my condo." I gave her Patricia's information that same afternoon, and I checked in with her periodically over the following months. And I want to tell you that her story ended the way mine did, with a recorded revocation filed just in time, a title company that caught the discrepancy before any actual harm was done, a family that eventually, painfully, had an honest conversation it had needed to have for years. I tell you about her not to make myself sound heroic, because honestly, all I did was answer her question honestly and hand her a business card. I tell you about her because I think it matters, in a story like mine, to understand that what happened to me wasn't some singular, freakish family dysfunction. It's a pattern that happens quietly, all across this country, in families that look completely ordinary from the outside, and the only real defense against it is exactly the kind of unglamorous, procedural literacy that nobody teaches you until you've already been burned by not having it. It's been just over 2 years now since that Thanksgiving, and I want to tell you what my life actually looks like now, in the plain, unglamorous present tense, because I think endings matter more when they're specific rather than vague, when you can actually picture the rooms and the faces rather than just the general shape of everything worked out. I still live in the house on Larkspur Lane, The screened-in porch my grandmother's bequest paid for has become my favorite room in the entire house. The place where Daniel and I have coffee every morning before work. The place where I sat, just last month, reading a picture book to my niece Grace while Tyler and Brianna unloaded groceries in the kitchen for a family dinner I was hosting. The oak floors I sanded by hand 8 years ago have developed the particular soft patina that only comes from years of actual living, scuffed in places by dog paws. Daniel and I adopted a scruffy rescue mutt named Biscuit the year after we got married, worn slightly thin near the doorways where feet pass through most often. My relationship with my parents is not perfect, and I want to be honest about that rather than tying this up with a bow that oversells how completely people can change after 34 years of an established pattern. There are still occasional moments where I catch a flicker of the old reflex in my mother, a comment that centers Tyler slightly too automatically, and I still, sometimes, have to name it out loud rather than let it slide. But the crucial difference, the difference that actually matters, is that when I name it now, she hears it. She doesn't defend the old arithmetic. She adjusts, sometimes clumsily, sometimes not quite completely, but genuinely. And that effort, sustained now over 2 full years, has slowly, carefully rebuilt something between us that I did not think was possible to rebuild the night I sat in my kitchen with a pan of cold turkey and a phone in my hand. My father and I have, unexpectedly, become closer than we've ever been in my entire life. He calls me now, regularly, just to talk, something he genuinely never did before any of this happened, and I've come to understand that some of his silence during my childhood wasn't indifference so much as a kind of learned passivity, deferring endlessly to my mother's management of the family's emotional life, because that's simply how his own parents had operated. Watching my grandmother's eulogy shake something loose in him seems to have given him permission to finally show up in a more direct way, and I've chosen to receive that late arrival with more grace than I might have offered a few years earlier. Because I've learned, through all of this, that people are sometimes capable of change decades later than you'd have hoped, and that the choice to accept a late, genuine effort doesn't erase or excuse the years it took to arrive. It simply means you get to have more good years than you would have had if you'd shut the door permanently. Tyler is a completely different person than the man who called me furious about a honeymoon 3 years ago, or at least, I should say, more precisely, he has access now to a version of himself that always existed underneath the golden child performance our family built around him, a version that is actually competent, actually resilient, actually capable of handling hard things without a rescue arriving before he even fully understands what's happening. He got promoted last spring, a promotion he earned entirely on his own, without a single phone call to our parents, without a single dollar of anyone else's money smoothing the path. He and Brianna bought a modest house of their own last fall, financed the old-fashioned way, through years of actual saving, a fact he mentioned to me with a note of genuine, hard-won pride that I recognized immediately, because it was the exact same pride I remembered feeling, crying in my own driveway 8 years earlier, the first time I held the keys to a house that was entirely, undeniably, mine. Thanksgiving this year will be at my house again. All of us, Tyler and Brianna and Grace, my parents, Daniel even. This year, my Aunt Carol and her family, a full, ordinary, complicated family gathering, the kind that exists in millions of houses across this country every November. No folders required, no lawyers on retainer, no photographs of strangers standing on anyone's porch. I've told this story now to enough people, friends, colleagues, strangers after those talks I give, even, eventually, a few of you who've reached out after hearing some version of it. that I've come to recognize certain questions people ask me almost every single time, and I want to answer them directly, here, at the end, because I think the specific mechanics matter as much as the emotional arc. People ask me, first, how I knew to check on that power of attorney at all, and the honest answer is that I didn't know, not really, not with any certainty. I had a feeling, a small, nagging inconsistency in a dinner table conversation, and I chose to act on that feeling rather than dismiss it, because I had spent enough years training myself, professionally, to notice small inconsistencies in financial conversations that the instinct simply kicked in, almost involuntarily, at home as well as at work. I want to tell you that you do not need a financial analyst's career to develop this instinct. You simply need to take seriously the small, uncomfortable feeling that something in your family's financial conversations doesn't add up, rather than talking yourself out of it because raising the question feels rude, or paranoid, or disloyal. People ask me, second, whether I regret letting the sale process play out as long as it did instead of stopping it the moment I revoked the power of attorney. I've thought about this one carefully, many times, and my honest answer is no, though I understand why some people would choose differently. I needed, for my own sake, undeniable proof of a pattern I had spent 34 years being told I was imagining. If you don't have that particular need, if a quiet, private correction is enough for you, there's no requirement to build a dramatic confrontation the way I did. But if you're like me, if you've spent a lifetime being told your perception of unfairness is exaggerated, there may be real value, for your own clarity and your own eventual peace, in gathering documented proof before you ever confront anyone at all. People ask me, third, and this is the one that always takes the longest to answer honestly, whether it was worth it, whether exposing my family's dysfunction so completely, so undeniably, was worth the risk of losing them entirely. I want to answer that honestly rather than with an easy platitude. It might not have worked. My parents might have doubled down, defended themselves, chosen Tyler's comfort over any real reckoning, the way they had chosen it for 34 consecutive years before that Thanksgiving. If that had happened, I would have lost my family, or at least the version of it I'd always hoped might still be possible underneath all the old patterns, and I would have had to grieve that loss while also knowing I had protected myself as thoroughly as I possibly could. But here is what I've come to believe, sitting on my porch 2 years later with a mutt asleep at my feet, and a niece who calls me on video chat just to show me her drawings. Some relationships that look intact from the outside are actually already lost, quietly, slowly, in 1,000 small moments of being overlooked. And the only real question is whether you find out while there's still enough of the relationship left to actually repair, or whether you keep performing a piece that was never real until there's nothing left underneath it to save. I would rather have known. Even if the answer had been the painful one, I would rather have known the truth of my own family than continued living inside a comfortable, unexamined story that wasn't actually true. If you are the reliable one in your family, the one who doesn't need saving, I want to leave you with something practical, rather than just sentimental. Review whatever legal documents you've ever signed involving family members, powers of attorney, joint accounts, anything granting someone else authority over any part of your life, even documents that felt like harmless formalities at the time you signed them. Talk to an actual attorney, even for 1 hour, even if it feels excessive, even if you tell yourself your family would never actually do anything with that authority. And pay attention to the small, uncomfortable feelings, the offhand comments at dinner tables that don't quite add up, because sometimes those small feelings are the only early warning you're going to get before something you built with your own 2 hands is nearly taken from you by people who never once stopped to ask whether you'd mind. I ran into Deb, My 71-year-old neighbor, formidable keeper of the entire street's business, on my porch just last week, and she asked me, the way she occasionally still does, whether I ever found out about that real estate woman with the tablet. Because in all these years, I'd never actually told her the full story, only a vague, deflecting version at the time that let her know the immediate mystery had resolved itself. I sat down with her on the porch steps that afternoon, biscuits sprawled between us in a patch of late afternoon sun, and I told her the whole thing, start to finish, the power of attorney, the folder, the Thanksgiving dinner, all of it. Deb listened without interrupting, which I've learned, over the years, is rarer in a person than you'd think. And when I finished, she sat quietly for a moment, looking out at the street she'd lived on for 40 years, and said, "You know, I always wondered why that agent looked so nervous walking back to her car that day, like she already knew something wasn't quite right." She patted my knee. "Good thing you're the kind of person who notices things too." I laughed and told her that noticing things had cost me a fair amount of peace of mind over the years, and she said something that I've thought about often since, in the particular blunt, practical way Deb says most things. Peace of mind you get from not noticing things isn't really peace, honey. It's just delay. Better to notice early and deal with it, than notice late and lose the whole house. I think about that conversation often, actually, more than I expected to when it happened, because it captures something essential about the entire experience that I struggle to express as cleanly in my own words. The comfortable version of my old life, the one where I didn't question the pot roast dinner comment, where I let the small inconsistencies slide because raising them felt disloyal, where I trusted that my family's love made formal protection unnecessary. That version of peace was never actually real. It was delay, exactly as Deb said, a debt quietly accumulating interest, waiting to come due at the worst possible moment, which for me turned out to be a Thursday evening phone call about a house I'd spent 6 years saving for and 18 months rebuilding with my own 2 hands. The real peace, the durable kind, the kind I actually have now, came only after I was willing to notice the uncomfortable thing, act on it even when it felt paranoid and excessive, and eventually sit at a table and make undeniable to 4 people I loved exactly what they had tried to do to me. It was not a comfortable process. It cost me months of anxiety, a genuinely difficult holiday season, and a version of my family I had to grieve before I could build a better one in its place. But it is real. This piece, in a way the old version never was, and I would choose it again, every single time. Without hesitatio, I saw Patricia Alvarez again, about a year after everything had settled. This time for the entirely mundane purpose of updating a beneficiary designation on a retirement account after my wedding. And near the end of that appointment, as she was gathering the paperwork, she paused and said, "Can I tell you something professionally that I don't usually share with clients?" I told her, of course, and she leaned back in her chair and said, "In 22 years of practicing law, your case is one of maybe half a dozen I still think about regularly. And it's not because of the legal complexity, because honestly, once we found that recorded revocation, the legal analysis was almost embarrassingly simple. It's because of the restraint you showed. Most people, once they realize they hold that kind of leverage over people who've wronged them, especially family, either use it as a weapon immediately, out of understandable rage, or they cave completely, out of guilt, and let the leverage evaporate without ever actually addressing the underlying harm. You did neither. You built the exact amount of pressure needed to force an honest reckoning, and then you used it precisely, deliberately, to get something real instead of something merely satisfying. I told her that it hadn't felt precise or deliberate in the moment, that most of it had felt like stumbling forward through fear and hurt and hoping I was making the right call, and she laughed and said, "That's usually what precision looks like from the inside. It rarely feels as clean as it looks from the outside," looking back. She told me, too, about some of the other cases that had crossed her desk in the years since mine, cases that hadn't ended as well, families where the confrontation had simply blown everything apart with nothing left afterward to rebuild, families where the person who'd been wronged had ultimately decided the leverage wasn't worth using at all and simply absorbed the loss silently, the way I imagine an earlier version of myself might once have done. The version who existed before that offhand comment at a pot roast dinner sent me into her office in the first place. "I don't have a formula for which outcome any given family gets," she said. "I've stopped trying to predict it. What I can tell you is that the families who at least had accurate information, real documents, real dates, real proof, rather than just competing feelings and decades-old grievances, tended to have a better shot at an honest outcome, whatever that outcome ended up being, than the families who never had anything solid enough to actually anchor the conversation." I left her office that day thinking about all the other Claires out there, sitting at kitchen tables in houses across the country, sensing that something in their family's financial arithmetic didn't quite add up, deciding whether to trust that feeling or talk themselves out of it one more time. I hoped, driving home, that at least a few of them would choose to trust it. I want to end where I began, because I think there's something worth returning to in that image. A woman crying in a driveway before she even has the key in her hand, overwhelmed by the sheer improbable fact of finally having something entirely her own. Last month, on a gray Tuesday in March, exactly the kind of gray Ohio does so well, I stood in that same driveway on Larkspur Lane, 8 years almost to the day since I first stood there with a real estate agent and a set of keys I hadn't earned yet. Grace was visiting, 3 years old now, chasing Biscuit around the yard in her small yellow rain boots, shrieking with laughter every time the dog let her almost catch him before darting away again. Daniel was on the porch my grandmother's bequest had finished, going over a crossword with my father, the two of them arguing amiably over a 6-letter word for reconciliation that neither of them could quite land on. My mother was inside, in my kitchen, teaching Brianna her recipe for the pot roast that had started all of this, all those years ago, at a dinner table that felt like it belonged to an entirely different family than the one gathered in and around my house that afternoon. I stood in that driveway for a long moment, watching all of it. The ordinary, imperfect, hard-won scene of people I loved occupying a space that had almost been taken from me by some of those very same people. And I thought about the folder, still sitting in its fireproof lockbox in my office, a document I hope I never need to open again, but one I will never regret creating. I thought about the version of me who cried in this exact spot 8 years earlier, exhausted and hopeful, having no idea what the house would eventually cost her to keep. I wanted, standing there, to tell her something, some piece of hard-won knowledge I wish I could have handed her earlier, and I think it would have been this. The house was never really the thing you were protecting. The house was just the physical shape of something much larger and much more important. Your own right to exist in your family as someone whose needs mattered as much as anyone else's. Someone whose steadiness was not an inexhaustible resource to be quietly redistributed to whoever needed rescuing that year. You're going to have to fight for that, I would have told her. Not with anger, not right away, but with clarity, with documentation, with a willingness to let an uncomfortable truth become undeniable rather than staying comfortable and deniable forever. And it is going to cost you something real, a version of your family's easy peace, a version of yourself that always assumed love made boundaries unnecessary. But on the other side of that cost, There's an actual family waiting for you. Imperfect and still working on itself, but real in a way the earlier version never was. Grace ran up to me in the driveway just then, breathless, her yellow boots muddy, and asked me to come see the fort she and Biscuit were building behind the garage, and I let the whole memory go, the driveway from 8 years ago, the folder, the Thanksgiving table. All of it settling quietly into the place where memories go once they've finished doing their work. And I followed my niece around the side of the house I had built, twice now in two very different ways, into exactly what I always wanted it to be. I want to tell you one more piece of this story before I close, because it's the piece I get asked about almost as often as anything else, and it's the piece that surprised me the most when I finally learned the full shape of it. What actually happened to Sandra? The real estate agent who had called me that first week apologized quickly and hung up before I could ask another question, and to the brokerage that had, apparently without much scrutiny at all, agreed to list a house based entirely on my mother's word that she held valid authority to sell it. I learned the details from Patricia, who had reason to follow up with the brokerage's managing broker once the title issue surfaced, partly to make sure no further paperwork moved forward, and partly, I suspect, because Patricia has never in her professional life met a sloppy process she didn't want corrected on principle. It turned out that Sandra was relatively new to real estate, barely 18 months into her license, working under a managing broker named Rick, who had a reputation, Patricia gathered through a few careful phone calls, for moving listings fast and asking fewer questions than the fine print of his profession technically required. When my mother first called that brokerage, she had brought with her a copy of the original power of attorney document, the one from the hospital, 2 years old by then too, and Rick, by his own later admission to Patricia, had glanced at it, seen that it appeared to be a properly executed durable power of attorney naming Linda Bennett as agent, and considered his due diligence complete. He hadn't run a full title search himself at that early stage, hadn't checked the county recorder's office for any subsequent revocations, hadn't asked my mother a single follow-up question about why an adult daughter's power of attorney from an old surgery was suddenly being used to sell her home for an unrelated family purpose. He had simply seen a document that looked official enough and moved forward, because moving forward quickly was, apparently, how his brokerage measured success. Sandra, to her credit, according to what Patricia was able to piece together, had actually felt uneasy about the situation from fairly early on, uneasy enough that she'd taken those photographs of my porch and roofline with a kind of hesitant, overly formal thoroughness that Deb had noticed and correctly read as slightly off. Sandra told Patricia, in a conversation I wasn't part of but heard about secondhand, that something about the arrangement had bothered her from the beginning, that she'd asked Rick directly whether they should verify the power of attorney's current validity before listing, and that Rick had told her not to worry about it, that the paperwork looked fine and slowing things down would just annoy the client. When the title company's hold notice came through, and it became clear that the sale was not only stalled, but legally impossible, and that the reason was a properly recorded revocation the brokerage should have caught in a basic title search before ever agreeing to list the property, Rick's brokerage found itself facing its own uncomfortable reckoning, entirely separate from my family's. Patricia's inquiry, gentle but pointed, made clear that a formal complaint to the State Real Estate Commission was very much on the table if the brokerage's practices around verifying seller authority didn't change immediately. I don't know all the details of what happened internally at that brokerage, but I do know that Sandra called me directly, about 2 months after everything fell apart. An unprompted call I hadn't expected and almost didn't answer, recognizing the number only vaguely. She apologized, genuinely, this time at length, rather than in the rushed, guilty 30 seconds of our first conversation. She told me she'd pushed for stricter verification procedures at the brokerage going forward, that she'd insisted on a full title search as a mandatory first step before any future listing, regardless of how urgent a client claimed their timeline was, and that Rick, after some resistance, had agreed. Mostly because the alternative was a formal complaint neither of them wanted on record. I should have asked more questions from the start, she told me. I had a bad feeling about it, and I let myself get talked out of it because it wasn't my job to interrogate a client's family situation, but it should have been my job to verify the actual paperwork, and I didn't do that carefully enough, and I'm sorry for what that cost you, even though I understand now it wasn't really my mistake alone. I told her I appreciated the call, and I meant it, because it would have been easy for her to simply disappear into the anonymity of a brokerage's collective liability and never speak to me again. Instead, she'd apparently spent 2 months pushing for an actual procedural change, which struck me as a small but genuine form of the same accountability I'd been trying to build within my own family. Not just an apology, but a demonstrated structural change in how the mistake could happen again. Rick, I later heard through Patricia's professional grapevine, left the brokerage about a year later under circumstances nobody described to me in detail, though I noticed, when I looked the company up out of idle curiosity sometime after, that their website now featured a fairly prominent statement about their rigorous seller verification process, language I suspect exists, at least in part, because of a family drama they never wanted, and a young agent who had the good sense to feel uneasy about a shortcut before that unease was validated by an actual legal mess. I want to close one more loose thread before I finish, because I think it says something true about how families process shame collectively, not just individually. I told you earlier about my cousin Melissa, who had posted something vague and pointed on social media that weekend about some people caring more about money than family, a post that several relatives had eagerly forwarded to me as though delivering breaking news. I didn't hear from Melissa again for almost a year after that, which didn't surprise me particularly, since we'd never been especially close, more cordial holiday acquaintances than anything resembling real friendship. But the following Thanksgiving, the one after the confrontation, when my parents mentioned that Melissa and her mother, my Aunt Carol, wanted to come by briefly to see everyone, Melissa arrived looking noticeably uncomfortable and pulled me aside in my kitchen before dinner even started. "I owe you an apology," she said, without preamble, which surprised me because Melissa had never struck me as a woman inclined toward direct confrontation of her own behavior. "I posted that thing last year without knowing anything about what actually happened. My mom told me some vague version where you were being difficult about helping Tyler, and I just believed her, because that's the story I'd always heard about your family, ever since we were kids. I never actually asked you what happened. I just assumed the version I already believed." I told her I appreciated her saying so, and I asked her, gently, what had changed her mind, and she said, "My mom finally told me the actual details a few months ago. The power of attorney, the folder, all of it. And I realized I'd spent basically my whole life hearing this story about your family, where you were the cold, difficult one, and Tyler was just this easygoing golden boy who couldn't help that good things came to him, and I never once stopped to ask why that story always seemed to require you to be quietly at fault for something." I told her that I understood exactly what she meant, more than she probably realized, because I had spent 34 years inside that same story before I ever managed to see its actual shape from the outside. We talked for a while longer, standing in my kitchen while the rest of the family gathered in the other room, and by the end of it, Melissa had deleted the old post, though she told me she'd also, at my gentle suggestion, left it up for a few days first with a follow-up comment correcting the record, because I told her I thought it mattered less that the original post disappear quietly, and more that anyone who'd seen it understand it had been wrong. It was a small repair in the scheme of everything else that year, but I found it meaningful in a way I hadn't expected, because it confirmed something I'd come to believe deeply by that point. The old family story, the one where I was difficult and Tyler was easy, the one where my steadiness made my needs invisible, had never actually been true. It had simply been repeated often enough, by enough people, across enough years, that it had calcified into something that felt like truth, even to people who barely knew our family at all. Breaking that story required more than just one Thanksgiving dinner. It required, it turned out, a slow, ongoing process of correction, one relative, one conversation, one honest accounting at a time. I've had strangers ask me, in the years since I started telling pieces of this story out loud, what actually changed inside me, underneath all the practical mechanics of folders and lawyers and recorded phone calls. And I think the honest answer is smaller and quieter than people expect. So I want to end with it plainly, without dressing it up. What changed is that I stopped believing my own comfort was less important than everyone else's convenience. That sounds like such a simple sentence, almost embarrassingly obvious when you say it out loud, and yet it took me 34 years and the near loss of my home to actually believe it in my body instead of just understanding it intellectually. For over 3 decades, I had operated on an unspoken family rule that said the person who could handle disappointment gracefully should be the one asked to handle it, over and over, precisely because she handled it so well the first several hundred times. I had mistaken that graceful handling for a personality trait, something essential to who I was, rather than recognizing it for what it actually was. A role I had been assigned before I was old enough to consent to it, and had simply never questioned, because questioning it had never once, in my entire childhood, produced a different outcome. The folder didn't create that shift in me. The folder was just the tool. The shift itself happened earlier, quietly, in a lawyer's office on an ordinary Wednesday during my lunch hour, the moment I decided that a vague, uncomfortable feeling about a comment at a pot roast dinner deserved to be taken seriously rather than dismissed as paranoia. Everything after that point, all the recordings and screenshots and the Thanksgiving dinner itself, was simply the natural, almost inevitable unfolding of a decision I'd already made the day I sat down across from Patricia and said, out loud, for the first time in my life, I have a feeling something isn't right, and I want to protect myself before I find out for certain. If you take nothing else from everything I've told you, I hope you take this. The feeling that something in your family's arithmetic doesn't add up is not, in itself, disloyalty. It is information. You are allowed to act on it quietly, privately, protectively, long before you ever have to say a single confrontational word out loud to anyone. You do not need permission to make sure the things you've built with your own 2 hands cannot be taken from you by people who love you but have never quite learned to ask. I hope your version of this story, if you ever need one, ends the way mine did, with a table full of people who chose, eventually, imperfectly, to become honest rather than continuing to comfortably rewrite history. But even if it doesn't end that way, even if the people in your life choose the house, the honeymoon, the wedding, the golden child, over the truth you've finally made undeniable, I want you to know that protecting yourself first was never the wrong choice. It was simply, finally, the right one, arriving decades later than it should have, but arriving all the same. I still have that $4 blue folder from the office supply store. It sits in a fireproof lockbox now, mostly forgotten, occasionally remembered, a small, unremarkable object that once held inside it the entire truth of my family, waiting patiently to be believed. I smiled the day I opened it at that table. I want you to understand, finally, exactly why. It wasn't triumph, And it wasn't cruelty. It was the particular, hard-won relief of a woman who had spent her whole life being told she was imagining things, finally holding, in her own two hands, undeniable proof that she never was.